What if history isn't random, but rigged? Not by gods or conspiracies, but by something darker, pattern. A silent hand scripting coincidences so strange, so eerily perfect, they make fate look lazy. From sunken ships to vanished inventors, from royal deaths to cartoon prophecies, these aren't just accidents, they're echoes. And tonight, we're following them down a 2-hour rabbit hole where the past folds in on itself and nothing happens just once. Welcome to historical coincidences that will creep you out, bring a flashlight, and maybe a mirror. Before we dive headfirst into this spiral of eerie patterns and historical déjà vu, take a second to hit that subscribe button, unless, of course, you're too afraid of what else might repeat. And while you're at it, drop a comment below. Where are you tuning in from? And what time is it right now? Because if there's one thing these coincidences teach us, timing is everything. The author and the uncanny prediction of a dictator. In 1914, before the Great War had even scorched its first trench into the European soil, an obscure writer named Morgan Robertson penned a peculiar story titled Beyond the Spectrum. It imagined a future conflict between the United States and a surprise aggressor from the East. The war begins with a sudden, unprovoked attack on American naval forces carried out under the orders of a mysterious Japanese leader named Futayama. Never heard of him? That's the point. Futayama didn't exist until he did. Because 27 years later, a real-life Japanese admiral named Isoroku Yamamoto would mastermind the attack on Pearl Harbor, just as Robertson described. Even stranger, Yamamoto, like Futayama, was a foreign, educated, calculating tactician known for his charisma and his fanatical loyalty to the emperor. This wasn't Robertson's first brush with prophetic fiction. His earlier novella, Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan, described a massive, unsinkable ship called the Titan, sinking after hitting an iceberg in the North Atlantic. It was published 14 years before the Titanic tragedy. You'd think that kind of clairvoyance would make someone rich, or at least a little paranoid. Instead, Robertson died penniless in an Atlantic City hotel room, which brings us to another kind of oceanic irony. The twin steamships and the date, the 10th of December. For most people, just a date somewhere between holiday shopping and year-end burnout. But for the steamships, City of New York, and City of Paris, it was the date to avoid if you had any intention of staying in one piece. Built as sister ships to the line that would eventually produce the Titanic, both vessels were the pride of transatlantic luxury in the late 19th century. And both, in completely unrelated years, managed to crash on the same date, the 10th of December. The City of New York suffered a collision with a smaller vessel in 1889. Not long after, the City of Paris met with a similar fate on the exact same calendar day, but a different year, different location. Same humiliation. And you can't exactly chalk this up to overbooked sea traffic or poor weather. These were peacetime routes, and the odds of that date aligning across sister ships in unrelated accidents is grotesquely slim. There's something deeply poetic about metal hulks that were supposed to tame the Atlantic getting humbled by their own shared birthday of destruction. And this isn't even the last time maritime arrogance got an ironic throat punch from fate, because long before they built machines to kill kings, they were building kings who invented machines to kill themselves. The king who died, and the invention of his execution method. King Charles I was executed in 1649, publicly, deliberately, with all the grim ceremony that a regicide deserves. He walked onto the scaffold at Whitehall, wearing 2 shirts to prevent the cold from making him shiver lest it be mistaken for fear. The axe fell, and England became, for a brief and very awkward moment, a republic. But here's the twist. The device that would later redefine the art of decapitation wasn't even invented yet. The guillotine, sharp, fast, and coldly egalitarian, wouldn't debut until the French Revolution, 150 years later. And yet the connection lingers. Because Charles's execution messy, politicized, slow was part of what gave rise to the Enlightenment's obsession with more humane ways to kill people. The French, watching history through the lens of revolution, thought, "We can do better. Off with your head, but efficiently." Ironically, Charles's death helped inspire a machine that would have made his own execution faster, cleaner, and depending on your tolerance for irony, more merciful. But history doesn't do mercy. It does cycles. And in a few hundred years, another war would begin and end with the bodies of soldiers bookending a nation, both in Virginia, both Union. Both completely unaware they were writing perfect literary symmetry into the American Civil War. The first and last Union soldiers to die in the Civil War. Elmer Ellsworth wasn't just the first Union soldier to die in the American Civil War, was a friend of Abraham Lincoln. Handsome, young, full of patriotic fervor and romantic tragedy, Ellsworth led the elite Zouave unit and marched into Alexandria, Virginia, in 1861. There, he saw a Confederate flag flying over the Marshall House Inn, stormed the building, tore down the flag, and was shot in the chest by the innkeeper. His death was mourned with national grief. Lincoln wept. Newspapers canonized him. 4 years and almost 750,000 deaths later, John J. Williams, a private from Indiana, was killed in the Battle of Palmito, ranch widely regarded as the final engagement of the war. The date? May 13, 1865. The location? Also, Virginia. As if time wanted to wrap the entire conflict in a tidy narrative bow, the war that began with Ellsworth's death in the eastern shadows of Virginia ended with Williams's in the same blood-soaked soil. Neither man knew they were bookends, but history did. It loves neat openings and dramatic closures. War, on the other hand, rarely obliges, especially when set to the music of the starsome of which wouldn't even be discovered until after the composer had already bowed out. The Composer and the Comet. Between 1914 and 1916, Gustav Holst composed The Planets, an orchestral suite that would go on to become one of the most celebrated musical representations of our solar system. Each movement was named for a planet and its corresponding astrological character. Mars, the bringer of war; Venus, the bringer of peace; Mercury, the winged messenger. It was celestial myth-making, rendered in strings, brass, and booming timpani. But one planet was conspicuously absent. Pluto. Why? Because it didn't exist, at least not to anyone on Earth. Pluto wouldn't be discovered until 193,014 years after Holst finished composing his magnum opus. The idea that a composer could musically tour the heavens and omit a planet that literally hadn't been found yet? That's not an oversight, that's a preview. As if Holst could sense a shadow out there, just waiting for a name. When Pluto was finally added to our planetary roll call, some composers rushed to complete Holst's work. But Holst himself didn't care. He disliked the suite's popularity, and had no desire to revise the celestial order. Maybe he understood that incompleteness was the point, a mystery hanging on the edge of our solar system. Much like a diagnosis that loomed on the edge of a silver screen time, Traveler's real-life timeline, the Back to the Future actor and his Parkinson's diagnosis. In 1985, Michael J. Fox lit up screens as Marty McFly, the fast-talking teen who hijacks a DeLorean to leap through time. He was all sneakers and sarcasm and skateboards a Gen X fantasy with a flux capacitor. But time had its own plans. Just 6 years later, in 1991, Fox was diagnosed with young-onset Parkinson's disease. He was 29. A man made famous for warping the timeline became trapped in one. The irony is so sharp it feels fictional. A man who played with time, now chased by a disease that steadily erodes his own. While audiences watched Marty McFly skip across decades with whimsy, the actor himself was beginning a slow, irreversible journey into physical limitation. The movie aged like a nostalgic relic. Fox did not. Time, it turns out, has a punchline. Parkinson's would go on to define Fox's later life. Not just his career, but his activism, his identity, his philosophy. He became a public face for a condition that took away his anonymity, his ease, his control, but not his irony. And if you think that's enough cosmic coincidence for one actor, wait until you hear about what happened in 69 AD when the Roman Empire speed ran through emperors like it was trying to make a political TikTok. The Roman Emperor and the year 69 AD? In most years, the Roman Empire crowned one emperor, occasionally two if someone got ambitious or assassinated. But in the year 69 AD, Rome went through four. It wasn't a monarchy. It was a demolition derby with laurel wreaths. First came Galba, the crusty old senator who strutted into power after Nero's suicide. He promised order and got stabbed. Then Otho, Galba's murderer and self-appointed successor, who lasted 3 months before losing a battle and killing himself out of shame. Enter Vitellius, a man so devoted to banquets he reportedly needed help standing. He was dragged through the streets and murdered by troops loyal to Vespasian, a general from the east who finally stabilized the empire. All in 1 year. It was like ancient Rome decided to try speed dating with emperors. A trial period for political disasters, civil war, betrayal, and chaos all in 12 lunar cycles. You couldn't even update your statues fast enough. Historians call it the Year of the Four Emperors. But really, it was the empire's dress rehearsal for collapse, an early sign that power built on swords tends to fall on them. And when it did, it was sometimes accompanied by laughter, especially if the guy behind the voices was buried with a punchline. 7 stories in, and we've already met drowned inventors, doomed emperors, and ghost ships that don't know how to stay sunk. If your brain's tingling and your timeline feels off, now's the perfect moment to subscribe. Trust us, it only gets weirder from here. And while the mysteries pile up, tell us in the comments where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it? Because something tells us you didn't stumble on this video by accident. The voice actor for Bugs Bunny and his tombstone. Mel Blanc wasn't just a voice actor. He was the voice actor. Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Porky Pig, Tweety Bird, Sylvester, Yosemite Sam. He was the Looney Tunes. One man, infinite voices. And if that weren't enough to solidify his place in cultural immortality, he left one final joke behind when he died. On his tombstone in Hollywood Forever Cemetery, the epitaph reads, "That's all, folks." It's perfect, funny, final, deeply unsettling if you really think about it. The man who brought to life the most chaotic animated universe in existence, who lent his lungs to rabbits, roosters, and cats, closed the curtain on his own life with the exact same line that had ended 1,000 cartoons. It's a reminder that even legends come with expiration dates. That behind every manic character and slapstick scream was a single mortal throat, and he knew it. Mel Blanc turned death into a callback. And not just any callback, the most iconic one in animation history. And if that doesn't chill you a little, try this. In 1942, the ocean claimed not one, but 2 American destroyers. Same war, same waters, same eerie pattern playing out beneath the waves. The twin shipwrecks in the same location. World War II didn't just claim lives it swallowed ships. In 1942, the Solomon Islands became a naval graveyard as battles raged through the Pacific like a drunk god overturning toy boats. Among the casualties were 2 U.S. Navy destroyers, the USS Gwyn and the USS Sterett. Both sank in the same cursed waters. The USS Gwyn went down in July after a Japanese torpedo blasted through her hull. Crew members leapt into the burning sea, clinging to life in a hellscape of oil and fire. Just months later, the USS Sterett met a similar fate nearby, her sleek frame ripped apart in another brutal engagement. Different dates, same stretch of ocean, same result. There's no rational explanation for why two warships of similar design would meet such similar ends in the same place, unless the sea remembers. Unless history repeats not because of fate, but because we refuse to believe it does. You'd think lessons would be learned, but we're not built that way. We keep sailing into the same dark waters. Just like a playwright who entered and exited this world on the same day before calendars were even consistent. The author who died on his birthday. The 23rd of April, a date now cemented in literary memory. William Shakespeare, the Bard of Avon, allegedly entered and exited the stage of life on this very day, born in 1564, dead in 1616. On paper, it's neat. Too neat. Almost performative. Like he was giving the greatest exit cue of all time. Curtain up, curtain down, same date, full circle. But the 16th century wasn't exactly known for precise record-keeping. Births were baptized, deaths were buried, and birthdays? That was a luxury for kings, not glove-makers' sons. Yet the myth stuck. Because humans love symmetry, especially when it feels earned. And if anyone earned literary symmetry, it was Shakespeare, whose works reveled in coincidences, mistaken identities, and the cruel clockwork of fate. It makes sense that a man who scripted so many timely deaths would choreograph his own. True or not, we believe it because we want to. We crave poetic closure. As if life's final joke should always rhyme with its opening line. But some stories don't close, they vanish. Like a man who invented a machine that made him rich, famous, and then mysteriously missing. The inventor of the diesel engine and his disappearance. Rudolf Diesel should have gone out with fanfare. He was, after all, the inventor of the diesel engine machine that literally reshaped the industrial world. Instead, he boarded a ship bound for London in 1913, had dinner, went to bed, and disappeared. No note, no witnesses, just an empty cabin and a missing man. His body was found days later, floating in the North Sea. Or at least, what was left of it. Identification was made by objects in his pockets. Not a mystery novel, real life. And very convenient if you're a conspiracy theorist. Some say it was suicide. Diesel was in debt. Others whisper darker theories. Oil barons, bankers, or even governments may have silenced him. Why? Because his engine could run on peanut oil. A threat to petroleum, and to the fortunes built on it. A man with a brain that could upend global fuel markets. Just gone, in the middle of an ocean, before a war that would run on his creation. It's the kind of ending that feels written by someone else. Someone with a dark sense of humor. The kind that also understood how television finales and national obsessions tend to share the same kind of audience. The MASH finale's viewership, and the Super Bowl. In 1983, America sat down to say goodbye, not to a war, but to a war show. The final episode of MASH aired that February, and nearly 106 million people tuned in. Streets were empty. Water usage dipped because no one wanted to miss a scene. It was the most watched television broadcast in U.S. history, unless you count the Super Bowl, which eventually overtook it. But that's sports. MASH was war, comedy, blood, and soap opera, wrapped in one surreal, laugh-tracked fever dream. The finale, titled Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, ran for 2.5 hours. Longer than many feature films. It wasn't just an episode, it was a funeral. And America mourned a fictional war set in Korea, but really about Vietnam, performed by actors playing doctors who often acted more like poets in fatigues. The irony? A sitcom about suffering became one of the most comforting shows of its era. It held up a mirror to trauma and people loved it, laughed through it, watched it religiously. And as millions wiped their tears that night, they looked up and saw stars, which, depending on your perspective, might not have actually been there. At least, Not in the way one troubled painter imagined. The painter of starry night and the absence of direct starlight. Vincent van Gogh painted The Starry Night in 1889 while confined in a mental asylum in Saint-Rémy de Provence. Swirls of color, burning halos around stars, a sleepy village dreaming beneath a night sky alive with motionates become one of the most recognizable paintings on Earth. But astronomers who've examined the canvas say something's off. The stars aren't real. Not that they don't exist, just that they don't align. The night sky, as Van Gogh depicted it, doesn't match what would have actually appeared over Provence at that time. Not in that pattern, not in that constellation. It wasn't astronomy. It was imagination, or madness, or revelation. Which makes the painting more than just beautiful. It makes it a premonition, a visual hallucination of a cosmos that doesn't obey math. Van Gogh, who stared too long into the night, didn't reproduce what he saw. He painted what he felt the universe doing behind the veil of reason. There's something eerie about that kind of artistic intuition. A man who couldn't look directly at life found a way to stare into the eternal. And yet, for all his cosmic vision, his personal orbit stayed painfully close to the ground where families made dentures and rode horses toward history. The founding father and his dentist's son. Paul Revere is remembered for his midnight ride and his urgent warning that the British are coming, a phrase he likely never actually said. But long before that historical game of telephone, he was a craftsman, a silversmith, engraver, and yes, a dentist. Revere didn't just dabble in dentistry, he practiced it seriously. He even made dentures for the wealthy, including at least one set carved from animal ivory and human teeth. A silversmith's precision applied to molars. There's something almost poetic about a man shaping smiles while warning of revolution. His son, also named Paul Revere, didn't ride into legend, but he did pick up his father's tools. Not the engraving tools, but the drills and molds of dentistry. Junior Revere became a successful dentist in his own right, quietly continuing the family's bizarre side hustle of tooth repair. So here we have a patriot father galloping into history, and a son quietly scraping plaque off Boston's elite. One warned of tyranny, the other cured gingivitis. Both carved a different kind of legacy into the American body. And speaking of legacies, the revolution Paul helped kickstart would one day be retold on Broadway, complete with beatboxing, hip-hop, and standing ovations in the same city where it all began. The Broadway show and the original setting. When Hamilton opened in 2015, it didn't just retell history, it seduced it. A musical about the founding fathers, delivered in rapid-fire hip-hop, layered with racial recasting and modern swagger. Alexander Hamilton, long buried beneath the dust of $10 bills and AP history classes, suddenly became a tragic rap god. But here's the haunting alignment. The show premiered in New York City, the very streets where Hamilton walked, argued, and bled. He dueled just across the river in Weehawken. He debated policy in nearby chambers. He chased immortality in the shadow of the same skyline that now frames the Richard Rodgers Theater. It's not just historical fiction, it's historical recursion. A musical about legacy, performed on the bones of the man's own legacy. The ghosts of duels and declarations are still echoing through the stage lights. And maybe it's fitting. After all, Hamilton's greatest fear was obscurity. He wanted to matter, to be remembered. And now, every night, thousands watch actors embody his rise and Fallon, the very island where his ambition once lit fires in the eyes of a fledgling republic. Which raises a question. What happens when empires rise by myth and then change their religion to one? The Roman emperor who made Christianity the state religion. Before Theodosius I, Roman emperors dabbled in gods the way modern shoppers try out streaming services. One week it's Jupiter, next week it's Mithras. Christianity was just another sect, a fringe belief system sprouting in the empire's underbelly, preaching peace and martyrdom in a culture built on conquest. That changed in 380 AD. Theodosius. I didn't just flirt with Christianity, he baptized the empire in it. With the Edict of Thessalonica, he made Nicene Christianity the official state religion, not an option, a mandate. Suddenly, centuries of Roman polytheism got tossed like yesterday's amphora. Temples were converted, statues were smashed, priests found themselves unemployed or worse. What's eerie isn't the sudden shift in theology, it's the speed with which it happened. A civilization that had built its identity around gods of war, wine, and vengeance now bowed to a crucified carpenter. And just like that, the Roman pantheon became museum exhibits. Theodosius didn't live to see the long-term effects, but the echoes of his decision reshaped history. Medieval Europe, the Crusades, the Vaticanal downstream from one imperial memo. And speaking of survival in the face of history, meet the woman who outlived not one, not two, but 3 doomed ships, including the Titanic. The man who survived the Titanic, Britannic, and Olympic incidents. Her name was Violet Jessup, and she should not have lived. Not once, not twice, but 3 separate times, on 3 different ships, she stared death in the face and casually walked away. First came the Olympic, in 1911, Titanic's older sister. It collided with another ship, and though it didn't sink, it was a terrifying prelude. Jessup was there, working as a stewardess. Then came the Titanic in 1912. The unsinkable ship hit the most famous iceberg in history, and down it went. Jessup escaped in a lifeboat, reportedly comforting others during the descent into maritime hell. You'd think that would be enough, but no. In 1916, during World War I, she was working as a nurse on the Britannic Titanic's younger sister when it hit a mine and sank in the Aegean Sea. Jessup was thrown into the water, cracked her skull on a lifeboat propeller, and still survived. Some called her Miss Unsinkable. Others quietly avoided sailing with her altogether. Superstition clings to people like her. Was she blessed, cursed, or just impossibly lucky? And if you think that's strange, consider what happens when a cartoon pop icon lends his voice to an innocent sitcom, only for the real-life headlines to make everyone squirm. The Simpsons episode, featuring a celebrity guest and his later legal troubles. It seemed innocent at the time, just another quirky episode of The Simpsons. A mysterious man named Leon Kompowski, who believes he's Michael Jackson, shows up at a mental institution and bonds with Homer. The voice was unmistakable, high-pitched, breathy, playful. It was Michael Jackson. Only, officially, it wasn't. Jackson used a pseudonym for contractual reasons, adding yet another surreal layer to the cartoon multiverse. The King of Pop voicing a fictional mental patient who impersonates the King of Pop. How meta is that? But the eeriest part wasn't in the episode, it was what came after. In the years that followed, Jackson would face a series of deeply troubling allegations and legal battles involving child abuse allegations that would taint his legacy and polarize public opinion. And yet, there he was, embedded in Springfield, a grinning animated version of himself immortalized in yellow, a time capsule that aged poorly, or maybe too well. The line between parody and prophecy blurred. The show had no way of knowing. Or did it? Because, as we'll see, artists often predict more than they intend. Just ask the composer who wrote Swan Lake about doomed love, all while swans swam in poetic foreshadowing. The composer of Swan Lake and the bird species, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, didn't set out to make ballerinas immortal, but he came close. In 1877, he debuted Swan Lake, a ballet steeped in cursed transformations, doomed romance, and the tragic grace of birds who were never meant to fly. The swan became not just a symbol of purity and longing, but an avatar for doomed beauty, elegant, aloof, fatal. What makes this eerie is how closely the ballet mirrors the real behavior of swans. These creatures, often seen gliding with supernatural calm across lakes, are fiercely monogamous, notoriously territorial, and startlingly violent when provoked. They will hiss, charge, and beat their wings like feathered demons if you come too close. Beneath the serenity, chaos. Tchaikovsky, tormented by inner conflict and living in a society that punished his sexuality, wrote music that twisted between joy and despair. He poured all his contradictions into the swana thing that is both delicate and deadly, innocent and doomed. The result was a ballet that feels like an elegy for something he couldn't say aloud. And speaking of monarchs navigating personal and political collapse, let's check in on a queen who ruled during the very birth pains of a nation that would one day ditch her husband's empire entirely. The Queen of England and the American Revolution. While George Washington was sharpening his rebellion, and Thomas Jefferson was writing his polite breakup letter to the crown, Queen Charlotte was arranging floral displays at Buckingham Palace. The wife of King George III, Charlotte reigned beside the man whose face would one day decorate dartboards in taverns across the American colonies. What makes this detail unnerving isn't just the proximity to revolution, but the strange silence surrounding her. While her husband was going mad, both figuratively and later literally, Queen Charlotte maintained a kind of ghostly grace. She supported the arts, raised 15 children, and watched as the empire began to unravel from across the Atlantic. She was also, interestingly, of possible African descent. Scholars debate her lineage, but some portraits hint at a heritage far more diverse than the monochrome myths of European royalty allow. So here we have a queen of partial African ancestry, quietly reigning during the rebellion that would birth a nation that would struggle for centuries with race, royalty, and revolution. And speaking of legacy and names, next comes a man who put his stamp on the American psyche with a gun that shares his name, and a strangely equestrian implication: the inventor of the revolver and his name's meaning. Samuel Colt, the man, the myth, the sidearm. In 1836, Colt patented the revolver, a weapon so effective, so simple, it became the unofficial mascot of the American frontier. The gun that won the West, spun in the hands of cowboys, sheriffs, and outlaws alike, all from a man whose last name means a young male horse, because of course it does. The symbolism practically writes itself. A Colt is wild, fast, and potentially lethal, just like the revolver he engineered. The Colt pistol didn't just shoot bullets, it shot holes through the way wars were fought and peace was negotiated. No longer did you need to reload after each shot. Just spin the chamber and fire again. Samuel Colt made death more convenient. He also made it profitable. He wasn't just an inventor, he was a marketer, selling his weapon to both the US government and civilians with equal enthusiasm. A tool of order, a tool of chaos. Pick your poison. There's something chilling about that duality, how one object can symbolize both freedom and destruction, depending on whose hand it's in. Much like actors playing lovable goofballs while quietly carrying obsessions far from the sitcom set. The Friends actor and his love for hockey. Matthew Perry played Chandler Binking of sarcasm, master of awkward pauses, and spiritual guide for anyone who's ever deflected intimacy with a punchline. But off-screen, Perry was anything but fictional. Long before Friends made him a household name, he was a nationally ranked junior tennis player in Canada, and beyond that, a passionate hockey fan. Hockey wasn't just a casual interest, it was woven into his DNA. Raised in Ottawa, Perry grew up steeped in the cold, punishing grace of the sport. It was the kind of love that survives fame, addiction, and sitcom reruns, a game of speed and violence, strategy and spontaneity, oddly reflective of Perry's own life. Even at the height of Friends, he'd sneak in games or drop into hockey-themed events, blending the lines between Hollywood and hometown loyalty. It's the kind of coincidence that feels engineered by a cosmic sitcom writer. The man most famous for being emotionally unavailable on television had a deep, enduring relationship with a sport that thrives on collisions, sharp turns, and icy resolve. And if you think that's just a nice character note, buckle up. Because now we head back almost a millennium to a battle that shaped the English language and crowned a king with an arrow in his eye. The Battle of Hastings and the year 1066. The year 1066 wasn't just any year, it was the year. The most overachieving entry in medieval England's calendar. In the span of a few months, 3 kings claimed the throne, 2 major battles reshaped the island's fate, and 1 unlucky monarch took an arrow to the face. The Battle of Hastings was the main event. The 14th of October. William, Duke of Normandy, later known as the Conqueror, landed on English shores with a well-organized army and a well-fed grudge. He clashed with King Harold II, who had just marched his men south after defeating a Norwegian invasion up north. Exhausted but proud, Harold held the high ground until he didn't. An arrow, legend says, struck him in the eye. That's one version. Another claims he was hacked down in the melee. Either way, he died, and William took the crown, forever altering the language, culture, and power dynamics of England. Why is it creepy? Because 1066 has become one of those strangely magnetic years. Everyone remembers it, everyone studies it. It sits in our historical consciousness like a warning Bella year where everything changed in a flash of blood and ambition. And not unlike the scream of a man captured forever in oil, horror, and one long silent echo. The painter of the scream and his influence on expressionism. Edvard Munch didn't paint a scream. He painted the scream, the one inside your head at 3 a.m., the one no one else hears but everyone feels. Created in 1893, the scream is more than iconicit's unnerving. A twisted face, frozen mid-howl, surrounded by a sky that looks like it's on fire and a sea that mirrors emotional collapse. Munch described the inspiration. A walk at sunset, when the sky turned blood red, and he sensed an infinite scream passing through nature. That sentence alone could fuel an entire psychological thesis. But the painting? It gave expressionism its bleeding heart. Expressionism isn't about realism, it's about the scream beneath the silence, the feelings that don't have words. Munch unlocked that aesthetic with one haunted canvas. And in doing so, he gave shape to 20th century art, psychology, and emotional confession. What's chilling isn't just the image, it's how familiar it feels. You've seen that scream in your own mirror, in a news headline, in the blank stare after hearing too much. And long before the age of emotional intelligence, one founding father dragged a kite into a storm and screamed at the sky in his own way, with science, keys, and electricity. The founding father who was a scientist and his kite experiment. Benjamin Franklin is remembered as many things sprinter, philosopher, diplomat, and lover of Parisian salons. But perhaps his most dramatic role was that of part-time lightning summoner. In 1752, he famously flew a kite into a thunderstorm, attempting to prove that lightning was, in fact, electrical. And because Franklin wasn't quite finished flirting with death, he attached a metal key to the string just to really tempt fate. The story has been mythologized, sanitized, and embedded into every elementary school textbook. But whether it happened exactly as described or whether Franklin was just cleverly claiming the credit, what remains undeniable is the experiment's symbolic power. A man facing the storm, daring nature to reveal her secrets. That kite wasn't just a child's toy. It was a philosophical wager, a dare against divine wrath, and it worked. Franklin's boldness helped pave the way for lightning rods and modern electrical theory. He didn't just capture lightning, he domesticated it. And so, a founding father became an icon not just of revolution, but of revelation, of science waging its own war against the unknown. A war that, ironically, would be reenacted on television where a scripted ER could sometimes outpace the real ones. The television show set in a hospital and the real-life medical advances, ER wasn't just another primetime drama. When it debuted in 1994, it brought chaos to your living room. Gurneys crashing through double doors, cardiac arrests in mid-sentence, surgeons yelling acronyms no one understood. But underneath the Hollywood gloss, the show was eerily close to real life. Created by Michael Crichtona, medical doctor turned novelist, it became a mirror of the medical world, reflecting not just its procedures, but its evolution. From organ transplants to emergency protocols, the series tracked alongside actual breakthroughs. Sometimes it even anticipated them, scripting storylines that eerily foreshadowed public health crises or treatment innovations. Doctors would later admit that ER had changed the public's expectations of hospitals. Suddenly, patients expected doctors to move like George Clooney, diagnose like Gregory House, and perform miracles under fluorescent lighting. Fiction had bled into reality and reshaped it. The unsettling part? How often the dramatized chaos matched real-world unpredictability. It was entertainment, yes, but also a soft confession. This is what it's really like to hold life in your hands while everything falls apart. And speaking of imagined places with disturbingly real implications, there was once an island designed in literature that questioned whether perfection itself was just another form of control. The author who wrote about Utopia and the actual island. Sir Thomas More coined a term that has haunted political theory and high school essays for over 500 years: utopia. In 1516, he published Utopia, a fictional account of an ideal society located on a remote island, perfect in its governance, serene in its social order, and deeply unsettling if you read between the lines. The word itself is a linguistic sleight of hand. Utopia is derived from Greek roots, meaning no place, a brilliant irony from the start. More wasn't painting a paradise, he was warning against one. His island was orderly, but sterile, efficient, but soul-numbing. A land where individuality vanished in the name of harmony. And yet, generations read it as a blueprint, a political wish list. Real-world philosophers, revolutionaries, and despots all tried to bend reality toward some flavor of utopia, usually ending in dystopia. More was executed decades later for refusing to endorse another imagined ideal, the king's version of religious reform. So the man who invented no place died for his refusal to live in the wrong one. An imagined island, a real execution. And next, a voyage into the frozen unknown where ships vanished and silence ruled for a century. The ship found in the Arctic and its captain's death. In 1845, Sir John Franklin set sail from England with two ships, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terroron, a mission to chart the elusive Northwest Passage. The expedition was equipped with everything Victorian science could offer: canned food, iron hulls, and naive optimism. Then, silence. For over a century. The Arctic swallowed them whole. No survivors, no signals, just scattered bones, eerie notes, and whispers of starvation and cannibalism. The ice gave nothing back. It wasn't until 2014 and 2016 that the wrecks of the Erebus and Terror were discovered, resting like frozen time capsules beneath the sea, perfectly preserved by the cold that killed them. Sir John Franklin, already an experienced Arctic explorer, died early in the expedition, though no one knows exactly how. He led his men into a blank space on the map and never led them out. That his ships were named Erebus, darkness, and Terror feels less like coincidence and more like foreshadowing carved in iron. This wasn't just a failed mission. It was a funeral procession trapped in ice, one that kept its secrets for 170 years. And while Franklin froze in myth, another artist was busy arranging colors and symmetry with almost pathological precision on the opposite end of human expression. The filmmaker and his distinctive visual style. Wes Anderson doesn't direct movies, she builds dioramas. Every frame, every shot, every prop placement looks like it was arranged by a man with a vintage ruler and an anxiety disorder. His films, The Royal Tenenbaums, Moonrise Kingdom, the Grand Budapest Hotel, are pastel-hued dollhouses populated by emotionally damaged adults pretending everything is fine. It's not just style, it's obsession. Symmetry so perfect it feels tyrannical. Whimsy so controlled it becomes menacing. Deadpan humor delivered in rooms that look like antique board games. And yet, somehow, it works. His worlds feel sealed off from time. Grief, bottled in sugar glass. Tragedy framed like a postcard. Anderson's characters often seem trapped by aesthetics, doomed to articulate their dysfunctions in quirky fonts and color-coded wardrobes. It's cinematic taxidermy. Everything looks alive, but nothing moves without a reason. That his films provoke both delight and unease is no accident. Anderson has turned control into art and, in doing so, mirrors the strange, unresolved tension between order and chaos. Which brings us neatly to another contradiction. A composer who wrote one of the most famous piano pieces of all time and left behind a title dedicated to someone history can't even identify. The composer of Für Elise and the mystery of its dedication. Ludwig van Beethoven wrote Für Elise around 1810, a delicate, haunting piano piece now played by every child who ever touched a keyboard. But here's the mystery. No one knows who Elise was. The original manuscript is lost. The name might have been mistranscribed, or invented, or symbolic. Over the centuries, scholars have floated candidates. Thérèse Malfatti, a woman Beethoven proposed to and was rejected by, is the leading theory. But her name wasn't Elise. Others suggest opera singers, students, unrequited loveswomen who flitted through Beethoven's life like minor keys. The piece itself isn't grand. It's intimate, almost hesitant. It feels like a letter never sent, or a memory half preserved. Not the storming Beethoven of the symphonies, but a man whispering through music. That this private composition outlived its context is both ironic and haunting. Everyone knows Für Elise. No one knows Elise. She has become a ghost note in music history, name attached to emotion with no clear owner. And speaking of names etched into stone, let's visit a Roman emperor who left his legacy not in music, but in miles of northern stone, meant to keep out the darkness. The Roman emperor who built a wall in Britain. Emperor Hadrian didn't conquer new land, she drew lines. His most famous line? A wall stretching 73 miles across northern Britain, marking the edge of Roman ambition and the beginning of everything Rome didn't want to deal with. Hadrian's wall wasn't just defensive architecture, it was philosophy in stone, a declaration that even empires have limits. Built around 122 AD, the wall cut across rolling hills and rough terrain. It bristled with watchtowers and forts, guarded by legions who probably wondered what exactly they were defending against. The Picts? Wolves? The existential dread of imperial overreach? Hadrian's wall was less about repelling armies and more about controlling movement, asserting dominance, and psychologically separating us from them. It was both a barrier and a billboard Rome, saying, this far, no further. And yet, even with all its imposing symbolism, the wall didn't last. It was abandoned, repurposed, broken down. Stones carried off to build sheep pens and cottages. Hadrian tried to make permanence. What he made was ruins. But his name lives on. As does another voice from antiquity, this one immortalized through pork-related stuttering and an actor who somehow voiced entire childhoods without ever breaking character. The Looney Tunes character known for his catchphrase, and the voice actor's name. Thursday. That's all, folks. It's one of the most iconic lines in pop culture history, and it belongs to a pig with a speech impediment. Porky Pig animated, awkward, Endlessly apologetica has been tripping over syllables since the 1930s, and behind that stammering charm was a vocal genius, Mel Blanc. Yes, the same Mel Blanc who voiced Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Tweety Bird, basically every voice in Looney Tunes that ever made you laugh while eating cereal. But Porky was special. His sign-off was the punchline to an entire generation's Saturday mornings. Blanc didn't just give the pig a voice, he gave him timing, rhythm, personality. He turned a joke about stuttering into an art form. And he did it so convincingly that most kids didn't know it was one man behind the curtain, switching characters like a vocal schizophrenic. The most surreal part? Blanc's tombstone bears Porky's final words. "That's all, folks. A cartoon's farewell engraved in stone, a joke that became a eulogy." And while Blanc gave life to animated animals, another icon of science gave life to radioactive elements and died slowly from the same. The first woman to win a Nobel Prize and her element discovery. Marie Curie wasn't chasing glory. She was chasing glow. Literally. The eerie, otherworldly shimmer of pitchblende, a uranium-rich ore that sparked her curiosity and eventually poisoned her body. She discovered two new elements, polonium, named after her homeland of Poland, and radium, which became synonymous with the miracles and horrors of early radioactivity. She won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903, shared with her husband Pierre and physicist Henri Becquerel. Then in 1911, she won again, this time solo, in chemistry. The first woman to win a Nobel, the first person to win two in different sciences. But Curie's triumphs came with a deadly price. Her lab notebooks are still radioactive. Her exposure to radiation without protective gear, because no one fully understood the risk, eventually led to her death from aplastic anemia. She glowed too close to the source. Her legacy? A mixture of awe and tragedy. She's revered in science, immortalized in textbooks, and yet she remains one of the few scientific martyrs, killed by the very force she unveiled. And if that doesn't give you goosebumps, consider the actor who made space smugglers cool and archaeologists tall while rewriting the cinematic universe. Twice. The Star Wars actor who appeared in multiple iconic franchises. Harrison Ford didn't just act colonized universes. In one galaxy, he was Han Solo, the wisecracking smuggler with a death wish and a Wookiee co-pilot. In another, he was Indiana Jones, the whip-cracking archaeologist who treated booby traps like mild inconveniences. Two characters, two franchises, one face. And here's the strange coincidence. Both roles weren't originally meant for him. Han Solo was supposed to go to someone else. Indiana Jones was almost Tom Selleck. But Ford, a carpenter-turned-actor with a squint that could melt sarcasm into charm, slipped into each part like fate had been waiting. The result? One man became the defining presence in two of the biggest cinematic mythologies of the late 20th century. He didn't just play Hirosh, became cultural architecture. People dressed like him, quoted him, modeled their sense of adventure and anti-authority snark on his performances. Most actors dream of one franchise. Ford had two, and he nearly walked away from both. He outlasted galaxies and Nazi temples. And speaking of legacies printed on sacred texts, another historical figure shaped not just the book but how it was made, the inventor of the printing press and the Bible. Johannes Gutenberg wanted to democratize knowledge. What he ended up doing was far more dangerous. He made it permanent. Around 1440, he invented the movable type printing press, a machine that turned books from sacred rarities into something dangerously reproducible. His most famous early project? The Gutenberg Biblia, beautifully typeset Latin edition that married craftsmanship with mass production. It wasn't just a book, it was a revolution in ink and ideology. Before Gutenberg, books were laboriously hand-copied by monks, expensive, rare, and often riddled with errors. After Gutenberg, they could be replicated with chilling precision. That meant the Bible, once locked behind church walls, could now be read by anyone with literacy and a spine. Gutenberg's press didn't just usher in the Reformation. It triggered a chain reaction. Literacy boomed, censorship became a full-time job, and truth got a lot harder to control. He died broke, of course. Revolutionaries usually do. But his legacy is inked into every page we read. And just like his press turned wine-stained paper into scripture, another little place in Boston turned a neighborhood bar into a cathedral of laughter and loss. The television show Cheers and its bar setting, where everybody knows your name. It sounds like a promise, or a threat, but in Cheers, it was a theme song, a soft, melodic reassurance that your dysfunction would always have a barstool waiting. The show, which ran from 1982 to 1993, was set in a Boston basement bar where the regulars weren't just patrons, they were pilgrims. Sam Malone, the former ballplayer turned bartender. Diane, the academic trapped in romantic purgatory. Norm, who entered the bar like a living sigh. Each character had their demons, but they faced them with punchlines and pints. What made Cheers uncanny wasn't just its staying power, it was how familiar it felt. The bar was both a set and a shrine. People who'd never set foot in Boston felt like they knew the place, because it wasn't just a bar. It was therapy, comedy, community. The bar never really existed, except it did. It was modeled after a real one, of course. But the deeper truth? It lives in the part of your brain that craves ritual, familiarity, and just the right amount of laughter to numb the existential dread. And speaking of dread, few authors have ever captured the chaos of war like the next one because he lived it, in the trenches, with a pen. The author of War and Peace, and his military background. Leo Tolstoy didn't just write about war, he smelled it, tasted its smoke, heard the soft thud of cannons echoing across Crimea long before he set a single sentence onto paper. His sprawling epic War and Peace, published in 1869, wasn't some romantic imagining of battle. It was lived trauma, transmuted into prose. During the Crimean War, Tolstoy served as an artillery officer. He wasn't just near the action, he was the action, boredom, horror, heroism, idiocy, all in equal measure. Those experiences bled into his writing. When Pierre watches the Battle of Borodino unfold in War and Peace, it's not just fiction, it's Tolstoy's shell shock refracted through Russian aristocracy. What's unsettling is how human everything feels in his narrative. Grand generals stumble through decisions. Soldiers die pointlessly. Peace is never quite peaceful. It's all too real, too recognizable even when the uniforms change. Tolstoy wrote like a man trying to translate pain into understanding, and somehow, through thousands of pages, he almost did. And while he painted war in epic brushstrokes, another historical figure focused on a very different canvas-using hairstyles that reached literal new heights of absurdity and opulence. The French queen, who had a famous hairdo. Marie Antoinette didn't just wear hair, she weaponized it. In 18th century France, fashion was politics, and the queen's towering hairstyles became a headline-grabbing, powder-dusted spectacle of excess. Her poufs weren't just tall, they were architectural marvels, built on scaffolding, adorned with ships, gardens, and even battle scenes. They often reached over a foot in height. They weren't hairdos. They were social commentary, masquerading as vanity. To some, they symbolized regal confidence. To others, obliviousness to the hunger just outside the palace gates. And therein lies the eerie coincidence. Her extravagant image became the perfect decoy for revolutionary resentment. While peasants ate dirt, she appeared in caricatures with powdered wigs and indifferent smirks. The truth was more complex. She was scapegoated, misunderstood, and deeply isolated, but by then, it didn't matter. The symbolism had stuck. Her hair had become prophecy. The guillotine eventually took her head, but not her image. That stayed, woven into wigs, books, paintings, and pop culture, as an icon of both glamour and doom. And speaking of duality, next story features a man who painted with both hands and wrote in a script even his own mirror couldn't decipher. The artist who painted the Mona Lisa, and his right-handedness. Leonardo da Vinci was a left-hander in a right-handed world, and he made sure everyone knew it. But he wasn't just left-handed. He was ambidextrous. Switching hands with the same ease, he switched disciplines. Engineering, anatomy, painting, architecture, his mind spun like one of his inventions, refusing to stay on one track for too long. What makes Leonardo truly uncanny, though, is how he wrote. His journals filled with sketches, formulas, and philosophical musings were penned in mirror script, right to left. As if only he, or a carefully angled mirror, could unlock their meaning. Some say it was to protect his ideas from theft. Others think it was just more comfortable for a lefty. Either way, it turned his notebooks into puzzles. And then there's the Mona Lisa portrait, so layered with secrets it's practically a Rorschach test. The smile, the background, the identity of the sitter, it's all debated. What isn't debated is this. It was painted by a man who could use both hands to construct mystery. Da Vinci didn't just make art, he made enigmas. And next, we hear the musical translation of this same spiritone that mapped the seasons not through science, but sound. The composer of the four seasons and its programmatic nature. Antonio Vivaldi didn't just write music, you could see it. His 1,723 masterpiece, The Four Seasons, isn't just a set of violin concertos, it's a symphonic time machine, a sonic weather report, a calendar with violins instead of numbers. What made it eerie besides its enduring popularity was its programmatic structure. Each concerto mirrored a different season, and each was paired with a poem, possibly written by Vivaldi himself, explaining what the music represented. You didn't need to guess. You could hear the springtime birds, the summer storms, the harvests of autumn, the icy creep of winter. The music didn't just express the mood, it narrated the environment. And it did so centuries before film scores existed. It was a kind of synesthesia, a way of translating nature into sound. And Vivaldi did it with almost surgical precision. His compositions read like meteorological prophecies wrapped in Baroque ornamentation. That he was a Catholic priest adds another layer. A man of the cloth, composing for the earth's rhythms while wearing a robe meant to serve the divine. A life split between altar and artistry. And while his music told stories of seasons, another Italian city birthed the Renaissance by nurturing not just artists but power brokers in velvet gloves. The city, where the Renaissance began, and its prominent family. Florence wasn't built in a day, but the Renaissance might have been born there in one. The city became a furnace of rebirth, lighting up Europe with humanism, perspective, sculpture, and scandal. What made Florence special wasn't just its artists, it was its patrons. And no patrons loomed larger than the Medici family. Bankers by trade, monarchs in everything but name, the Medicis weren't just rich, they were tastemakers. They didn't just buy art, they shaped it. Michelangelo, Botticelli, Da Vinci, touched by Medici money, Medici influence, and sometimes Medici paranoia. Florence became a paradox, a republic ruled by a family, a religious city that nurtured secular genius, a medieval town at war with itself while birthing the modern mind. You could get excommunicated and immortalized within the same decade, depending on who you painted for. The city hummed with contradictions, and beneath it all, the Medicis pulled strings like velvet-covered puppeteers. Their wealth built chapels and commissioned masterworks, but it also whispered assassinations and funded wars. From that contradiction came culture, and while Florence gave us beauty wrapped in politics, another animated team gave us logic wrapped in stammering and a mystery involving gender and cartoon voices. The Scooby-Doo character and the voice actor's gender? Velma Dinkley, the brain behind Mystery Inc., the queen of turtlenecks, the unspoken leader in a gang of lovable bumblers. Glasses perpetually askew, voice forever analytical. And yet there's a strange twist in her cartoon DNA. Her voice, sharp with reason, was provided not by a man, as some mistakenly believe, but by Nicole Giffey, a woman, whose voice just happened to sound like your favorite over-caffeinated librarian. The real coincidence isn't gender swapping or vocal confusion. It's how cartoons have always messed with identity. Bart Simpson, voiced by a woman. Timmy Turner, same. Velma fits perfectly into this cartoon tradition of vocal misdirection. Her brainy energy contrasted with Shaggy's stoned mutterings in Daphne's fashion-forward days. She was logic surrounded by nonsense. And her voice? Not the shrill genius of cliché, but an oddly calm deadpan. It was her tone-steady, relentless that made you trust her, even when she was chasing ghosts in roller skates. And while Velma was solving mysteries, across the Atlantic, another vessel was sinking not into obscurity, but into history. A real ghost ship, this one. Its death pulled an entire nation toward war. The ship whose sinking led to U.S. entry into WWI. The RMS Lusitania wasn't a warship, it was a passenger, liner luxurious, fast, and filled with civilians. But in May 1915, it became a casualty of geopolitics when a German U-boat torpedoed it off the coast of Ireland. The ship sank in just 18 minutes. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. And while the United States wouldn't enter World War I for almost 2 more years, the Lusitania's descent marked the beginning of that inevitability. Here's the eerie twist. The Germans had publicly warned passengers that ships sailing into war zones might be attacked. Many ignored the warnings. Some assumed no nation would dare target a civilian ship, least of all with American passengers aboard. They were wrong, and the consequences played out slowly, like a fuse burning toward war. The sinking wasn't just a tragedy, was a shift. Public opinion turned, conspiracies brewed. Was the ship secretly carrying ammunition? Was the U.S. being drawn into war by design? The answers remain cloudy. The ocean floor holds the wreckage, but history holds the narrativa moment when innocence and strategy collided in salt water and steel. And speaking of communication breakdowns, next comes a man who made distance obsolete with just a few electric clicks. The inventor of the telegraph and the communication speed. Samuel Morse didn't invent electricity, he just made it talk. In 1837, Morse and his collaborators developed the telegraph machine that could send messages across great distances using electric pulses. Short and long signals, dots and dashes translated into letters, words, language. It was slow by today's standards, but at the time, it was sorcery. One of the first messages sent by telegraph was almost philosophical in tone. What hath God wrought? It wasn't just a question, it was a prophecy. Because the telegraph didn't just shrink the world, it rewired it. Suddenly, news could travel faster than horses. War decisions could be relayed in real time. Commerce got faster. Panic did too. Ironically, Morse was a painter before he became an engineer. His early work captured stillness. His later work erased it. He turned silence into code. And yes, he gave us Morse code. A language born out of necessity but now permanently embedded into the eerie rhythm of old war films, distress calls, and forgotten submarines. A man who made machines speak. And then, decades later, a singer would make the world listen not with dashes and dots, but operatic bombast and a mustache that should have had its own passport. The singer of Bohemian Rhapsody and his theatricality. Freddie Mercury didn't sing songs, he summoned them. He didn't just perform, he invaded. With operatic drama, lightning in a bottle charisma, and a voice that ranged from whisper to volcanic eruption, Mercury redefined what a frontman could be. Bohemian Rhapsody, released in 1975, is part ballad, part opera, part rock anthem, and all contradiction. It has no chorus, no conventional structure. It tells a story that makes no sense and all the sense in the world, because Mercury wasn't writing a narrative, he was writing emotion. The man himself was just as layered. Born Farrokh Bulsara in Zanzibar, raised in India, reinvented in Britain. He studied design, he wrote hits, he broke barriers. And he did it all with a flourish of the theatrical capes, tights, and that unforgettable strut. He turned vulnerability into spectacle. But here's the darker twist. His theatricality wasn't just about showmanship, it was armor. A way to deflect, to distract, to dazzle. Behind the glitter and the winks was a man battling isolation, illness, and a world not yet ready for his truth. Mercury died in 1991, but Bohemian Rhapsody plays on louder, weirder, and more immortal than logic should allow. And just like a cathedral risen from fire, the next figure turned ruins into resurrection. The architect of St. Paul's Cathedral and the Great Fire of London. In 1666, London burned for 4 straight days. The Great Fire devoured 13,000 homes, dozens of churches, and, at its symbolic center, old St. Paul's Cathedral. The blaze left behind a ghost city of smoldering ruins and scorched morality, tales divine punishment or urban accident, depending on who was shouting loudest. Enter Sir Christopher Wren, a mathematician turned architect who was given a nearly divine mandate: rebuild the cathedral. And not just rebuild, reinvent it. Wren didn't just restore a symbol. He replaced it with a masterpiece of Baroque architecture, crowned with a dome that would redefine the London skyline. The coincidence is layered. A city destroyed by fire, only to be resurrected by a man with an almost holy obsession with geometry and divine proportion. St. Paul's became more than a cathedral, it was a statement. Of resilience, of rebirth, of a capital refusing to bow to chaos. Wren is buried there, beneath the very stone he raised. The inscription over his tomb says it all. Si monumentum requiris, circumspice. If you seek his monument, look around. And speaking of monuments, the next man played one until fate did the kind of rewrite that no screenwriter would have dared touch. The actor who played Superman in the movies, and his real-life paralysis. Christopher Reeve was Superman. Not just the costume, the curl, or the gravel-voiced truth-telling. He had the jawline, the morality, and that rare thing in Hollywood, sincerity. Between 1978 and 1987, he gave the Man of Steel a human heart. But in 1995, Reeve fell off a horse during a jumping competition. 1 second, he was airborne. The next, paralyzed from the neck down. The irony wasn't just cinematic, it was mythological. Superman, the invincible alien savior, undone by gravity and spine. Reeve didn't vanish. He pivoted. Became a vocal advocate for spinal cord research. A beacon of grace under unbearable limitations. He used the remnants of his fame to challenge science, funding, and public perception. He stayed in the spotlight not for roles, but for roles redefined. His body failed. His voice didn't. His image, one symbol of otherworldly strength, became one of very human endurance. A man trapped inside the mythology he once wore. Superman's cape never touched the ground, but Reeve's story reminds us what happens when we believe the symbol too much. And speaking of symbolic legacies, the next tale belongs to a man who built languages before building the world they were meant for. The author who wrote The Lord of the Rings and His Invention of Languages. J.R.R. Tolkien didn't just write fantasy, he engineered it. Most authors invent worlds so they can tell a story. Tolkien invented languages, then reverse engineered the cultures, histories, and geographies that might have produced them. Elvish wasn't a gimmick. It was a fully functioning linguistic system, built from roots and phonetics and grammatical nuance. Only then did he start writing stories. What's unsettling isn't just the scale of his ambition, It's the eerie way it all feels. Real. The Lord of the Rings doesn't read like fiction. It reads like myth unearthed, ancient songs remembered. Places you almost recognize from dreams. Tolkien was a philologist, obsessed with how language shapes thought, and how words carry memory like bone carries marrow. Middle-earth wasn't escapism, it was a reconstruction. A mythology for England that never quite existed. A lament for a world that had already been lost. He claimed the stories came to him like echoes, not inventions, but translations. Maybe that's the part that creeps in, the feeling that Tolkien didn't create Middle-earth. He remembered it. And just like memory shapes myth, fire once shaped politics through an emperor who watched his city burn and his reputation with it. The Roman emperor who persecuted Christians and the Great Fire. In 64 AD, Rome burned. The Great Fire devoured most of the city over the course of 9 days, reducing palaces, temples, and crowded slums to blackened rubble. And in the middle of this nightmare, Emperor Nero. Whether he fiddled while Rome burned is probably fiction. The fiddle hadn't been invented yet, but the image stuck, and so did the blame. What's more disturbing than the fire is what happened after it. Nero, desperate to deflect suspicion that he'd orchestrated the blaze himself, possibly to make way for a new palace, needed a scapegoat. He found one in a growing religious cult, the Christians. They were already viewed with suspicion, accused of secret meetings, cannibalistic rituals, and refusal to worship the state gods. So Nero gave the people a spectacle: mass executions, crucifixions, and even human torches Christians coated in pitch and set ablaze to light his garden parties. A literal echo of the fire he supposedly didn't start. It's the kind of coincidence that feels scripted. A fire consumes a city, a ruler deflects with another kind of flame, and history records the smoke, but never the match. And while Nero torched lives for spectacle, another artist simply asked the world to imagine peace and paid the price for imagining too loudly. The musician who wrote Imagine and his pacifist stance. John Lennon's voice never really softened. It just changed targets. From mop-topped Beatlemania to wide-eyed solo activism, Lennon was always tearing something down: authority, convention, himself. But in 1971, he tried something different. He imagined. Imagine, the most subversively sweet song in pop history, invites listeners to strip away everything: borders, religions, possessions, even the idea of heaven. It's a lullaby for revolution, sung with a melody so gentle you barely notice it's an anarchist's hymn. Lennon, deeply entrenched in anti-war activism with Yoko Ono, didn't just sing about peace, she staged it. Bed-ins, press stunts, billboards. He tried to weaponize idealism. The irony? He was constantly surveilled by the US government, labeled a threat, and smeared as unpatriotic. And then, in 1980, he was shot outside his New York apartment. A man who wrote the world's most famous peace anthem was murdered in cold blood by a deranged fan. It's the most bitter of ironies. A man who asked us to imagine no violence, erased by it. But, long before Lennon ever sang a word, another explorer crossed oceans and rewrote the map while missing a different kind of mark entirely. The explorer who discovered America, Columbus, and the first European landing. Christopher Columbus didn't discover America, he just branded it better. In 1492, Columbus sailed west in search of Asia and stumbled into the Caribbean, mistaking island after island for the outskirts of the East. He never set foot on what is now the United States. He died, thinking he'd found a shortcut to India. And yet, schoolchildren still chant his name like he invented the continent. The real first European landing in North America? That likely belongs to Leif Erikson, a Norse explorer who reached Newfoundland around the year 1005 centuries before Columbus ever crossed the Atlantic. No parades, no federal holidays, Just a Viking and some primitive real estate. Columbus, of course, had better PR. He returned with captives, gold, and a narrative that fit neatly into imperial ambition. His discovery sparked an age of conquest, colonization, and genocide, dressed up as destiny. The eerie part isn't just the historical amnesia, it's how comfortable we've become with the mislabeling. A man celebrated for discovering something that had already been found. A legacy built on mistaken geography and overwhelming confidence. Which brings us to a different kind of miscalculation. A looming apocalypse rendered in ones and zeros and one show that saw it coming. The television show The X-Files and the Millennium Bug. The X-Files wasn't a television show, it was a paranoia delivery system. Government conspiracies, alien abductions, psychic experiments, and deep state cover-ups. It fed on the 1990s ambient mistrust and gave it a plot twist every Sunday. But as the millennium drew closer, the show's storylines began to mirror the cultural anxiety pulsing beneath Y2K. The Millennium Bug, an apocalyptic software glitch predicted to strike at midnight on the 1st of January. 2000 wasn't a fictional invention. It was real fear. The idea was simple and terrifying. Because many computer systems abbreviated years with 2 digits, the rollover from 99 to 00 could trigger global malfunctions. Planes would fall, banks would collapse, nukes would arm themselves, or not. The X-Files leaned into this digital dread. It aired episodes that blurred the line between organic paranoia and technological prophecy. The show didn't just explore the Y2K fear, it gave it a voice, wrapped in cigarette smoke and government shadows. When the 1st of January, 2000 arrived, nothing happened. But the anxiety lingered, because the X-Files wasn't about what would go wrong, it was about believing it already had. And while the show painted conspiracies in grayscale, another painter used black and blue to scream against the real-world terror of war. The painter of Guernica and his early blue period. Pablo Picasso was never sentimental. He was surgical. His brush didn't soothe it, dissected. And nowhere is that clearer than in Guernica, the 1937 anti-war masterpiece born out of the bombing of the Basque town during the Spanish Civil War. It's massive, stark, bleached of color except for haunting blacks, whites, and grays. It doesn't tell a story. It detonates one. Screaming horses, shattered mothers, twisted bodies. Guernica isn't about war. It is war, rendered in sharp lines and collapsing geometry. What makes this painting eerier is its contrast with Picasso's earlier blue period, a phase where he painted beggars, prostitutes, and the broken-hearted in melancholic hues of blue and green. Those works whispered despair. Guernica shrieks it. The emotional journey from the muted sadness of the blue period to the full frontal anguish of Guernica mirrors Picasso's political awakening, from detached observer to visual protester, from loneliness to outrage. The canvas became a weapon, and long after the bombs stopped falling, the painting remained a mirror no one wants to look into. And while Picasso wielded paint like a scream, another royal figure tried to wield power after being dethroned. His name was Puyi, and his comebacks were as unsettling as his downfalls. The last emperor of China and his restoration attempts. Puyi was crowned Emperor of China in 1908. He was 2 years old. Imagine that, a toddler seated on a golden throne, surrounded by eunuchs and marble, while a dying dynasty collapsed around him. By 1912, the Qing dynasty fell, and Puyi was officially dethroned, but allowed to remain in the Forbidden City, playing emperor of nothing. Then, in 1917, he was briefly restored by a military warlord during a failed coup. It lasted 12 days. Decades later, in 1934, Puyi would be installed yet again, this time as the puppet ruler of Manchukuo, a Japanese-controlled state carved out of Manchuria. A throne made of lies, guarded by bayonets. He was a man forever being reinserted into a script that no longer fit. powerless in power, a symbol manipulated by forces he couldn't control. After WWII, he was captured by the Soviets, then returned to China and re-educated. He lived out his final years as a humble gardener. The emperor who once ruled from a dragon throne ended his days trimming bushes in obscurity. And while his reigns began with fanfare and ended in farce, another literary figure died in the same country, where his most iconic creation wandered through foggy alleys and logical mazes. The author who died in the same city as his famous character. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the man who conjured Sherlock Holmes from a mix of cold logic, violin strings, and Victorian fog, died in Crowborough, East Sussex, England. Holmes, meanwhile, is eternally associated with Londona, city of cobblestone clues and opium dens, hansom cabs, and gaslight. But here's the geographical twist. Though Holmes roamed the streets of London in fiction, Conan Doyle himself died just a train ride away, close enough to hear the echo of Holmes's footsteps if fiction had ears. It's as if the character never really left, and the creator couldn't bring himself to go far. Doyle famously tried to kill Holmes off at Reichenbach Falls, only to resurrect him under public pressure. The world couldn't let go, and perhaps neither could he. Holmes was both his curse and his monument. Doyle dabbled in spiritualism later in life, believing in seances and fairies. Holmes, the ultimate skeptic, would have scoffed. It's an ironic split the believer who created the unbeliever, and they both lived and died within the foggy breath of England's southeast. And from fog to fruit next, we explore how citrus became a harbinger of death in a film saga built on whispers, blood, and betrayal. The film, The Godfather, and the use of oranges. In the Godfather films, death has a scent, and it's citrus. Scattered throughout Francis Ford Coppola's Mafia saga, oranges show up like cheerful little warnings. A fruit bowl here, a rolling orange across the floor there, harmless at first glance until someone gets shot, strangled, or has a heart attack moments later. Coincidence? Possibly. Intentional? Absolutely. The symbolism is subtle, never spoken, but once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Vito Corleone buys oranges at the market, then gets gunned down. Later, he plays with his grandson in a tomato garden, an orange slice in his mouth, before collapsing. Oranges, sweet and innocent, become the soft signal of carnage. It's poetic irony, the fruit of vitality doubling as the fruit of decay. The Mafia's world, so rich in ritual and aesthetics, finds its visual death note in a grocery aisle. The unsettling part is how something so mundane gets weaponized. The Godfather films transformed fruit into dread, and every time you see an orange on screen now, a tiny part of your brain prepares for a body to fall. Which brings us to another sound of doom that rides in on wings, brass, and a Wagnerian fury that would later soundtrack modern apocalypse. The composer of The Ride of the Valkyries and his use in Apocalypse Now. Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries was never meant to accompany helicopters. It was written in the 1850s as part of his massive opera cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen, where Norse warrior maidens descend from the skies to collect fallen heroes, myth, grandeur, drama. Then came Apocalypse Now. In Francis Ford Coppola's Vietnam War epic, Wagner's stirring score is blasted from speakers attached to American attack choppers as they swoop down to obliterate a Vietnamese village. The scene is cinematic, perfection and moral horror, majestic music underscoring grotesque violence, art clashing with atrocity in 5.1 surround sound. It's one of the most jarring juxtapositions in film history, a piece designed for gods repurposed for gunships. The scene isn't just memorable, it's unforgettable precisely because it shouldn't work. The music elevates the moment, then betrays it. Or maybe it's the other way around. Wagner wrote for legends. Coppola filmed the fall of men. Together, they scored a ballet of destruction. And as Europe once watched battles rage on foreign soil, another eerie maritime coincidence was unfolding across the Atlantic. Two German ships, stranded far from home, both finding themselves in the same harbor as war whispered its arrival. The unlucky day for ships in the same location. In August 1914, as World War I cracked the sky over Europe, two German passenger liners, the SS Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse and the SS Kronprinz Wilhelm, met an unexpected fate. These weren't warships. They were floating palaces designed for elegance and transatlantic prestige. But the moment war broke out, they were caught in hostile waters, far from friendly ports. In a strange twist of maritime déjà vu, both ships ended up in the same American harbor. New York, interned, trapped in neutral territory. Safe, but irrelevant. These proud behemoths of German engineering were suddenly useless, ghosts in a harbor that had no place for them anymore. What makes this a true coincidence isn't just the shared port, it's the timing. The war had only just begun. The world hadn't yet figured out its trenches or alliances. And yet these two ships, symbols of pre-war splendor, were already sidelined by fate, moored in a country that hadn't chosen a side. Later, both would be repurposed for war efforts, rebranded, refitted, their civilian glory days long behind them. Their fate mirrored the century. Optimism docked, conflict underway. And while these ships were rendered mute, another inventor gave sound a voice only to be betrayed by silence himself. The inventor of the phonograph and his deafness. Thomas Edison gave the world-recorded sound, and yet he could barely hear it. In 1877, Edison invented the phonograph, a machine that could capture sound on tinfoil and play it back. The first voice ever recorded? His own, reciting "Mary Had a Little Lamb." It was science fiction turned reality, a machine that could bottle the air and uncork it later. But Edison's hearing was severely impaired for most of his life. Some say it was due to childhood illness, others blame a train accident. Either way, he lived in a world half-muted, yet obsessed with sound. He created devices he couldn't fully enjoy, cylinders, discs, telephone saw inventions, shaped by someone who could barely perceive their output. There's something deeply ironic, even haunting, about a man who gave humanity the ability to immortalize voices while his own auditory world was fading. He turned sound into legacy, while silence slowly claimed his. Edison's deafness never slowed his ambition. If anything, it sharpened his focus. But the coincidence remains brutal. The prophet of recorded sound lived in a kind of acoustic purgatory. And while Edison made voices eternal, another author found his muse in a group of very real boys who would never quite escape the shadow of Neverland. The author of Peter Pan and the boys who inspired him. J.M. Barrie didn't just write Peter Pan, he needed to. The story of the boy who wouldn't grow up was born not just from whimsy, but from loss, obsession, and an eerily codependent friendship with a group of brothers, the Llewellyn Davies boys. Barrie met them in Kensington Gardens, charming them with stories and games. Over time, he became a fixture in their lives then, a guardian. Their father died, their mother died. Barrie stepped in. It wasn't just mentorship, it was something more complex, and perhaps unsettling. He adopted them, wrote them into his stories, froze them in fiction. Peter Llewellyn Davies, the most famous by association, hated the connection. That terrible masterpiece he once called Peter Pan. The boy who inspired the eternal child grew up haunted by him. Barrie never had children of his own, but he created a mythology of childhood so powerful it swallowed his real-life relationships. The boys never stood a chance. It's a disturbing irony, a tale about escaping adulthood born from the lives of children who couldn't. Fiction gave them wings. Reality clipped them. And just as these boys were being immortalized in ink, 6 new faces were being immortalized on television, playing best friends in a city that never blinks. The television show Friends and the casting of the main characters. In 1994, 6 relatively unknown actors sat on a Central Perk couch and rewrote sitcom history. Friends wasn't just about coffee and Quipsit, was a cultural juggernaut built on an eerie kind of chemistry. Jennifer Aniston, Courtney Cox, Lisa Kudrow, David Schwimmer, Matthew Perry, and Matt LeBlanc didn't just play friends, they became them, on screen and off. The unsettling part isn't just how well the casting worked, it's how accidental it all was. Some had nearly missed their auditions. Others were last-minute swaps. None had any idea they'd be immortalized as avatars of 20-something neurosis. But by some cosmic alignment, the 6 actors fell into orbit around each other and never drifted. Over the years, the boundaries between character and actor blurred, their salaries matched, their real-life relationships mirrored their fictional ones. The ensemble wasn't just believable, it was mythic. They aged together, became inseparable in public consciousness. The world didn't just watch Friends, they adopted them. And behind all the laughter, there's a kind of ghost story. 6 people who pretended to love each other until it became real, or vice versa. And speaking of icons in steel and stone, the next man built a monument to France and tucked a little gift inside another. The architect of the Eiffel Tower and his previous work. Gustave Eiffel's name is synonymous with Paris, etched into the skyline by 7,300 tons of iron and 1 million tourist selfies. The Eiffel Tower was originally mocked as an eyesore, an industrial monstrosity looming over the romantic city, but Eiffel didn't just build, Eiffel defended it, fought for its existence, outlived its critics. And now? It's the most visited paid monument on Earth. But Eiffel's fingerprint stretches across the Atlantic, too. Years before his tower, he helped design the internal framework of the Statue of Liberty. That's right, the bones of Lady Liberty were born in France and engineered by the same man who later pierced the Parisian sky with a wrought iron spire. 2 monuments, 2 nations, 1 engineer, a man obsessed with making metal do the impossible. There's something poetic, even spooky, about the overlap. The Statue of Liberty, symbol of welcome. The Eiffel Tower, symbol of French pride. Both iron. Both impossibly tall. Both defying time and corrosion. Eiffel didn't just build structures. He built identities. Anchors for cities that had already lost themselves once or twice. And speaking of losing things like originality, ownership, and perhaps a few $1 million, the next story involves one of rock's greatest riffs and one of music's messiest lawsuits. The band Led Zeppelin and their lawsuit over Stairway to Heaven. Stairway to Heaven is sacred ground in the pantheon of rock. 8 minutes of slow-building guitar, mystical lyrics, and a crescendo that feels like spiritual ignition. It's the song that launched 1,000 air guitars and made Jimmy Page's fingers legendary. But then came the lawsuit. In 2014, Led Zeppelin was accused of lifting the song's iconic opening riff from a lesser-known band called Spirit and their instrumental track, Taurus. The chord progression was similar, hauntingly so. Enough to spark years of legal battles, debates among musicologists, and a public reckoning with the blurred line between inspiration and theft. What made it eerie wasn't just the possibility that rock's most hallowed hymn might be borrowed, it was that it made sense. Zeppelin had toured with Spirit. Page admitted owning the album. The timing lined up like ominous notes on a staff. Ultimately, Led Zeppelin won the case. The courts decided the similarities weren't enough, but the shadow remains. Every time the opening notes of Stairway echo through a speaker, the question lingers in the chords. What do we own, really? And sometimes, the earth itself claims ownership, like in a Roman city buried in ash, its final breath preserved in time. The Roman city, buried by a volcano and its preservation. In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted like a divine exclamation point, silencing the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum in a storm of ash, gas, and molten stone. Of the two, Pompeii became the more famous thanks in part to how completely it was frozen in time. The eruption didn't just kill it embalmed. Entire streets, homes, mosaics, and even people were preserved beneath layers of volcanic debris. The result? A perfect snapshot of Roman life, captured not in ink but in catastrophe. Loaves of bread still in ovens, graffiti on brothel walls, dogs curled where they died. Pompeii is more than archaeology, it's an existential prank. A city caught mid-sentence, a reminder that civilization is one bad day away from becoming a cautionary tale. Its preservation was accidental, but the lesson isn't. Nature doesn't care about your empire, your culture, or your bathhouse murals. When the earth decides to shrug, all your gods and glory get buried together. And speaking of immortality through trauma, the next story brings us back to the painter who saw swirling heavens. Lonely canvasand shared his soul with the only person who ever truly listened. The painter of the starry night and his brother's name. Vincent van Gogh was a genius with a self-destruct button. A man whose color-drenched madness redefined modern art and whose emotional landscape was as tormented as any thunderstorm he ever painted. But through all of it, poverty, rejection, isolation, there was Theo. Theo van Gogh, his younger brother, wasn't just a sibling. He was a lifeline, an art dealer, a confidant, a translator of Vincent's volcanic inner world into something resembling stability. Their correspondence over 600 letterces, a masterclass in love, mental illness, and the brutal mechanics of creativity. Van Gogh painted the starry night while confined in an asylum. Theo received the letter describing it. Theo saw the genius even when the galleries didn't. And Theo died just 6 months after Vincent, as if grief short-circuited his own system. Their bond is haunting. Van Gogh's art, posthumously celebrated, owes its survival to Theo's persistence. Without him, there is no gallery wall, no legacy, no Van Gogh. 2 brothers, 1 legacy, and between them, a swirl of madness and light. And as one artist wrote pain in oil, another songwriter scribbled poetry and lyrics and somehow found himself standing alone at the Nobel podium for it. The musician who sang like a rolling stone and his Nobel Prize. Bob Dylan didn't want to be anyone's voice of a generation. He just wanted to write songs. Cryptic, sprawling, shape-shifting songs that sounded like riddles, sermons, and bar fights all rolled into one. And yet, in 2016, he became the first musician to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. The citation? For having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition. Translation? He made lyrics matter. Like a rolling stone, dropped in 1965, shattering radio expectations with its 6-minute runtime and sneering tone. It wasn't a love song. It was a lyrical punch in the mouth, dressed in metaphor and harmonica. Dylan wrote in code. His words could be political or personal or both, depending on the night. He wore masks, dodged interviews, changed genres like coats, and yet, his impact stuck. When the Nobel Committee called, Dylan didn't even show up. He sent Patti Smith to perform in his place. The irony? A man who redefined language and song was honored for literature and declined to speak. And from Nobel-winning enigmas to wounded warriors, the next story unfolds on ancient waves, in a sea battle that took 1 arm but made a legend. The author of Don Quixote and the Naval Battle. Miguel de Cervantes is best known as the creator of Don Quixote, deluded knight who jousts at windmills and rewrites the world to fit his fantasies. But before Cervantes tilted at literary giants, he fought in real ones. Specifically, at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, one of the most significant naval clashes in history. It was a brutal Mediterranean showdown between the Holy League and the Ottoman Empire. Cervantes fought as a soldier aboard the Marquesa. He was shot 3 times, 2 in the chest, 1 in the left hand. He survived. His left hand did not. It was rendered useless for life. They called him El Manco de Lepanto, the one-handed man of Lepanto. And yet, yet Cervantes didn't mourn his loss. He later wrote that he'd rather lose the use of both hands than miss the honor of fighting in that battle. A bold statement from a man who would go on to make his living through writing? So here's the strange loop. The author who created a character obsessed with fantasy suffered real wounds in real war, and from those scars, he created one of literature's most enduring comedies. And while Cervantes sailed into legend, another man orbited the Earth and changed the Cold War forever. The first man to orbit the Earth and the American space race. Yuri Gagarin didn't just touch the star she looped around them. On the 12th of April, 1961, the Soviet cosmonaut became the first human to orbit the Earth. One man, one capsule, one complete revolution in less than 2 hours. It was humanity's first trip beyond the atmosphere, and it scared the hell out of the United States. The space race was no longer hypothetical. It was political, philosophical, existential. Gagarin's flight wasn't just a scientific milestone, it was a flex. A loud, cold, Soviet grin pointed directly at Washington, D.C. He returned to Earth, a hero, instantly mythologized. Monuments were built, streets renamed, statues erected, and then silence. The USSR, ever secretive, kept Gagarin largely grounded afterward, fearing the loss of their celestial icon. He died young in a plane crash, under circumstances still debated. But the message was clear. Space had been touched, and it wasn't by the Americans. His flight intensified the arms race, inspired the Apollo missions, and left a single phrase etched in the cosmos: "Poyachali, let's go." And while Gagarin left the planet, the rest of us stayed grounded watching office workers pretend their lives were being documented by an invisible camera crew. The television show, The Office and its mockumentary style. When The Office premiered in the UK in 2001, it introduced a new kind of workplace horror, not tyrannical bosses or crushing deadlines, but the mundane. It took the everyday and filmed it like a nature, documentary dry, awkward, and merciless. The American version followed in 2005, stretching the same uncomfortable humor into 9 seasons of quiet existential dread. The mockumentary format characters glancing at the camera mid-humiliation, interviews spliced into cringe-blurred fiction and reality. Suddenly, every paper jam, every birthday party, every forced smile became surveillance. What makes this stylistic choice so strange is how quickly it stopped feeling like parody. Offices felt like this. Everyone knew a Michael Scott. Everyone was a Pam or a Jim Orletsby Anesta Toby. And then, toward the end, the show got meta. The characters discovered they were being filmed. Their entire lives had been turned into a series, reality within fiction collapsing into itself. It's not just a sitcom, it's a philosophical prank. What if the dullest moments were the most revealing? And while The Office was building tension from copy paper and small talk, history tells us of a king whose life ended in a Forsyth legacy sealed by an arrow. The king who died hunting, and his successor's name. King William II of England, better known as William Rufus, met his end not on a battlefield, but in a forest. In 1100, while on a hunting trip in the New Forest, he was struck by an arrow. The story goes that it was an accident fired by a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell, but history doesn't buy that so easily. There were no inquiries, no trials, just a quick burial in Winchester Cathedral. And almost immediately, William's younger brother Henry swooped in to claim the throne conveniently nearby, ready, waiting. It has all the ingredients of a medieval murder mystery. A king with enemies, a hunting accident, and a successor who benefits from the chaos. The fact that Henry became Henry I within days of William's death only adds fuel to the speculation. William Rufus was not a beloved king. He was brash, possibly atheistic, and had a tense relationship with both church and nobility. His sudden death resolved a lot of political headaches. Sometimes the forest is just a forest. Other times, it's an execution chamber with trees instead of walls. And while kings fell to arrows, another artist quietly immortalized a different kind of American royalty with pitchforks, aprons, and blank-eyed stares. The painter of American Gothic and his Midwestern roots. Grant Wood's American Gothic is one of the most misunderstood paintings in American history. Often parodied, frequently misread, it depicts a stern farmer and his equally unsmiling daughter or wife, depending on your interpretation, standing before a Gothic windowed farmhouse. It looks traditional, conservative, almost grim. But the irony? Wood was neither conservative nor grim, and the painting isn't an homage satire, a sly jab at Midwestern rigidity, an inside joke only the rural-born would recognize. Grant Wood grew up in Iowa, raised among cornfields and stoic neighbors. He understood the rhythms of rural life, but he also saw its absurdities. He painted American Gothic not to celebrate American values, but to subtly mock their stiffness. The irony is that it was embraced as a symbol of those very values. He gave America a mirror, and it framed itself in pride, not parody. Wood's style, regionalism, emphasized local stories, local landscapes, and a resistance to the abstract trends of modern art. He made the Midwest mythic. And as his painting's characters stared out with unsmiling eyes, another rock legend was tearing through octaves, rewriting what the human voice could do with or without irony. The composer of Bohemian Rhapsody and his unique vocal range. Freddie Mercury's voice didn't obey the rules. It floated, snarled, whispered, and exploded sometimes, all within the same verse. Scientists later studied recordings of his singing and found that his vocal cords operated with an unusual vibrato pattern. In short, the man was biologically tuned for drama. He had a 4-octave range. That's not just rare, it's mythical. Most classically trained tenors would be jealous. Mercury could jump from chesty rock growls to operatic falsettos in a single breath. And he did, night after night, on stages around the world. Bohemian Rhapsody remains the ultimate showcase. A song that defies structure, built for a voice that defied genre. Is it opera, rock, ballad? It doesn't matter. Mercury made it work through sheer vocal alchemy. But it wasn't just about notes, it was about emotion. His voice carried swagger and sadness, confidence and catastrophe. You believed him, even when you didn't understand him. He sang like he was running out of time, and in a way, he was. And as Mercury pushed the boundaries of sound, another queen, this one, ancient and political, was playing her own high-stakes game with empire, seduction, and the twin dangers of ambition and Rome. The last queen of Egypt and her Roman lovers. Cleopatra VII was the last of the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, a line of Greek-speaking monarchs pretending to be pharaohs. She was also, famously, the lover of not one, but two, of Rome's most powerful men, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and each of those affairs carried the weight of nations behind them. But here's the eerie symmetry. Both alliances ended in betrayal and death. Caesar, her first patron and the father of her son, was assassinated in 44 BC. Mark Antony, her co-ruler and war-bound lover, committed suicide after losing the Battle of Actium to Octavian. Cleopatra followed shortly after, allegedly via asp bite, though the details remain as hazy as her coal-lined eyes. What makes her story chilling isn't just the drama, it's how consciously mythic it feels. Cleopatra didn't just live history. She curated it. She studied rhetoric, languages, chemistry. She presented herself as the goddess Isis incarnate. Her death was a political performance, a final act in a play she knew Rome would write in its own image. With her fall, Egypt became a Roman province. The end of her life was the end of an era. And speaking of birth from strange dreams, the next literary icon brought a monster to life, not with science, but a storm. The author of Frankenstein and Her Dream. Mary Shelley was just 18 when she conceived one of the most enduring nightmares in Western literature. It happened during a summer retreat in 1816 at Lake Geneva with Percy Bysshe Shelley, Lord Byron, and others. An unusually dark, stormy season caused by the aftermath of a volcanic eruption in Indonesia. Trapped indoors, they passed the time with ghost stories. Byron proposed a challenge. Who could write the scariest tale? Mary had a dream, a vision of a pale student bending over a grotesque creature, jolting it to life with unnatural science. It wasn't just a horror story, it was prophecy. Frankenstein wasn't about monsters. It was about ambition, alienation, and the terrifying consequences of playing God. What's chilling is how young she was, how intuitively she understood the philosophical undercurrents of her time: industrial revolution, anxieties, scientific overreach, isolation in an increasingly mechanized world. She didn't write about a creature. She wrote about creation and regret. Mary Shelley gave birth to modern science fiction in a thunderstorm. No lab coat, no laboratory, just a candle, a fever dream, and the sense that something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. And speaking of legends dressed in robes, our next story involves a wizard, a knight, and a very real knighthood bestowed upon a man of stage and staff, the actor who played Gandalf, and his real-life knighthood. Sir Ian McKellen doesn't just play wizard, she is one. At least, that's how it feels when you watch him thunder through Middle-earth as Gandalf the Grey, and later White. With that voice, a gravelly mix of thunder and velvet transformed fantasy dialogue into Shakespearean command. But the coincidence here lies in the blurring of legend and reality. McKellen was knighted in 1991 for his services to the performing arts. So yes, Gandalf is technically a knight. Magic staff in one hand, royal honor in the other. What makes this eerie is how closely his real-life gravitas matches his fictional roles. Gandalf wasn't just a character, he was wisdom personified, the moral spine of the story. And McKellen, an openly gay man and lifelong activist, brought that same moral weight to his real-world battles, advocating for LGBTQ+ rights with the same conviction he brought to leading hobbits into battle. He's one of those rare actors who doesn't seem to disappear into roles as she amplifies them. Gandalf, Magneto, Richard III, they all become facets of the same powerful voice. And just as McKellen helped unify realms on screen, another ancient ruler attempted to unify empires by slicing one in two. The Roman emperor who divided the empire. Different context. In 285 AD, Emperor Diocletian looked at the increasingly unwieldy Roman Empire and made a decision no one before him had dared to try. He split it in half. It wasn't symbolicity, it was administrative triage. The empire had grown too large, too chaotic, too volatile to be governed by one man, even a man who thought himself divine. So Diocletian created the Tetrarchy, 2 emperors, Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, Caesars, each governing a quadrant of the Roman world. He hoped this structure would bring stability and smoother succession. What it brought instead was civil war, ambition overload, and a legacy of fragmentation. The split was both practical and prophetic. While Diocletian stepped down, voluntary, almost unheard of in imperial history, the East and West would never truly reunite. Eventually, the Western Roman Empire would collapse in 476 AD, while the Eastern Roman Empire, later the Byzantine Empire, carried on for another 1,000 years. The irony? Diocletian tried to make the empire more manageable. Instead, he laid the foundation for its permanent schism. And as emperors carved borders in marble, another man was creating soundscapes shaped by madness music that would outlive its own creator and haunt his band forever. The band Pink Floyd and their early leader's mental health. Before the Wall, before Dark Side of the Moon, there was Syd Barrett, the original architect of Pink Floyd's sound. Barrett wasn't just a frontman, he was the band's surrealist core. His songs were kaleidoscopic, whimsical, fractured. He played guitar like it was bending under psychic pressure. But by the late 1960s, Barrett's behavior grew erratic. His mental health spiraled. Whether due to schizophrenia, drug abuse, or both, he began to unravel. He'd show up to gigs and just stare, or not show up at all. Eventually, the band made a brutal choice. They replaced him. The eerie twist? Even after he was gone, he never really left. Pink Floyd's later albums are filled with echoes of Barrett. Wish You Were Here is practically a seance in vinyl form. Shine on You, Crazy Diamond was a direct, aching tribute. Barrett even wandered into a recording session unannounced years later, unrecognizable, ghost-like. It rattled them. The band that built its legacy on sonic alienation and existential dread had its soul shaped by a man slowly drowning in his own mind. And just as Barrett circled the brink, another voyager circled the Earth returning home with a map that no one had drawn before. The first circumnavigation of the globe and the survivor's logbook. Ferdinand Magellan set out in 1519 with 5 ships and a mission to find a western route to the Spice Islands. By the time the journey ended in 1522, Magellan was dead, most of his crew were gone, and only one ship, the Victoria, limped back to Spain. It was the first circumnavigation of the globe, and Magellan didn't even live to see it. The only reason we know what happened on that 3-year odyssey is because of one man, Antonio Pigafetta. A Venetian scholar and one of the few survivors, Pigafetta kept a meticulous logbook. His journal chronicled storms, mutinies, starvation, and skirmishes with indigenous peoples. He documented the surreal and the mundane with equal care: sea monsters, new constellations, men dying of scurvy. The trip proved, definitively, that the world was round and could be circled by sea. But that fact came at a grotesque cost: hundreds of lives, years of suffering, and the deaths of untold indigenous communities caught in the wake of discovery. Pigafetta's log is more than a travel diary. It's a record of awe, arrogance, and ambition colliding in open water. And just as his words preserved a voyage, another wall preserved a final mealand. The artist who painted it knew exactly where to place it. The painter of The Last Supper, and its location in a refectory. Leonardo da Vinci didn't just paint the Last Supper, he embedded it where it belonged. On the wall of a refectory, the dining hall of the Santa Maria delle Grazie monastery in Milan. It's not a canvas hung on a wall. It is the wall. A mural. A meal. A message. Imagine monks sitting down for dinner, spooning stew under the gaze of Christ and his apostles frozen in that precise, explosive moment. One of you will betray me. It wasn't just art, it was theater. Theology. A daily confrontation with mortality, loyalty, and divine irony. Da Vinci, ever the innovator, didn't use true fresco technique. He experimented with tempera and oil on dry plaster. The result? A masterpiece that started deteriorating almost immediately. But the positioning, placing the final meal of Christ in a room of constant meals, created a layering of sacred and mundane that few artists ever achieved. Time has gnawed at the image, but it endures, ghost-like. A religious moment immortalized in a space meant for earthly consumption. And while Da Vinci used paint to provoke reflection, another animated icon once used satire to prod a continent by stomping his way across it with cowboy boots and cultural jokes. The Simpsons episode where they visit Australia and the cultural jokes. Bart vs. Australia aired in 1995 and quickly became one of The Simpsons' most controversial episodes. What started as a boy trying to prove the Coriolis effect turned into a satirical whirlwind of international insult, kangaroo courts, and boot-based diplomacy. In the episode, Bart is forced to apologize to the entire country of Australia after making a prank phone call. What follows is a parade of cultural stereotypes, so exaggerated they border on surreal: beer, swilling yokels, a giant boot of punishment, koalas clinging like parasites. Australians were not amused. The reaction was swift and visceral. Letters to Fox, diplomatic scowls, and a barrage of criticism from both citizens and the media. Yet, like most Simpsons satire, the episode wasn't mocking Australia as much as mocking America's arrogant cluelessness abroad. But the creepier part? Many of the exaggerated elements felt plausible. The absurdity wasn't in Australia's portrayal, but in how closely it mirrored global tensions, cultural ignorance, and the performance of international apology. It was a yellow cartoon wielding a mirror. And sometimes, when the mirror is warped just right, the truth reflects back with too much clarity. And, speaking of reflection, the next story hums through a gravelly voice and a world that still manages to feel wonderful, somehow. The musician who composed What a Wonderful World and his nickname. Louis Armstrong had a voice like gravel soaked in honey. He didn't sing songs, she sandpapered them into your soul. And nowhere is that clearer than in What a Wonderful World, a song so gentle, so wistfully optimistic, that it's easy to forget who's singing it. Because Armstrong, affectionately known as Satchmo, short for satchel mouth, a nod to his wide grin and trumpet, playing prowess, lived through anything but wonderful times. Born in 1901 in New Orleans, he grew up in deep poverty during Jim Crow segregation, survived gang violence, and learned to play the cornet in a juvenile detention home. Yet in 1967, at the height of racial unrest and global conflict, Armstrong recorded a lullaby for humanity. Trees of green, skies of blue, friends shaking hands, babies crying. A song so simple, it almost sounds naive. Except coming from Armstrong, it becomes radical. It's not just a love song to Earth, it's defiance. A man who knew every crack in the world still chose to call it wonderful. And he didn't shout it, he smiled it. Through every note, every breath. And just as he gave his voice to optimism, another exile gave his pen to revolution writing from afar, but never quietly. The author of Les Miserables and his political exile, Victor Hugo wasn't just a writer, he was a political storm in velvet trousers. By the time he published Les Miserables in 1862, he had already been exiled for over a decade, banished by Napoleon III for opposing the authoritarian regime in France. So while the streets of Paris churned with revolution, Hugo was scribbling his masterpiece from Guernsey, a British island closer to sheep than street riots. But Hugo never left Francenois spirit. His pen was an act of resistance, and Les Miserables was a Molotov cocktail wrapped in prose. A story of convicts and cops, revolutions and redemptions, all steeped in a deep, unflinching humanism. In exile, he could see France more clearly. Distance didn't soften his outrage, it sharpened it. He watched from afar as Paris boiled, and he poured it into characters like Jean Valjean and Inspector Javert. His politics weren't hidden, they marched through his novels with bayonets. And when he finally returned to France, he was received like royalty. The exile became a prophet. His punishment was to be silenced. His revenge was to speak louder than ever. And while Hugo's voice thundered through fiction, another woman would quietly inherit a crown and be played, decades later, by actresses in royal costume. The actress who played Queen Elizabeth II and the real Queen's reign. In The Crown, Claire Foy and Olivia Colman didn't just portray Queen Elizabeth III became her, each taking a decade of history and wrapping it in lace, power, and veiled emotion. Foy handled the early years, the trembling post-war Britain, the young monarch finding her spine. Colman picked up the baton with middle-aged gravitas, showing a queen weathered by duty and distance. What's unsettling isn't that they played her so convincingly. It's that her reign was so long, it required a generational handoff within the same series. Real-time monarchy unfolding across scripted decades. A fiction that couldn't keep up with the reality it tried to portray. Elizabeth II's reign was one of contradictions, ceremonial but political, passive but omnipresent. She was the face on currency and stamps, the human symbol of continuity in a nation addicted to change. The actresses mirrored that paradox, stoic, elegant, yet subtly fractured. It wasn't just acting, it was an impersonation of history still being written. And as one queen ruled through silence, another ancient city told its final tale in carbonized scrolls and vaporized dreams preserved by fire, not forgotten by time. The Roman city of Herculaneum and its tragic preservation. If Pompeii is the headline, Herculaneum is the footnote, smaller, quieter, but arguably more intimate in its devastation. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, it didn't just bury cities in ash, it annihilated them with pyroclastic flow surges of superheated gas and rock moving faster than sound. Herculaneum was hit harder than Pompeii. It wasn't coated in ash, it was incinerated. And yet, paradoxically, that destruction preserved it better. The intense heat, carbonized wood, food, and even papyrus scrolls. Buildings remained standing, balconies intact. Entire shelves of furniture froze in mid-collapse. In some homes, skeletal remains were found in boathouses, people huddled by the sea, waiting for rescue that never came. The eerie part? Those people were vaporized in seconds. Flesh turned to steam. Death wasn't slow, it was instant, which is why the preservation is so detailed. Their final positions are not guesses. They are real. Walking through Herculaneum feels less like exploring ruins and more like trespassing in a disaster that just happened yesterday. And while Michelangelo was painting heaven onto ceilings not far from Rome, another rival artist was etching his name into papal history one fresco at a time. The artist who painted the creation of Adam and his rivalry with Raphael. Michelangelo didn't just paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, he redefined the visual vocabulary of divine creation. The creation of Adam, where God and man reach across the void with outstretched fingers, has been reproduced so many times it feels almost cliché. But in its original form, it is thunderous, raw, charged with the terror of creation itself. Yet while Michelangelo was craning his neck under scaffolding and layering paint with wrath and precision, another artist was gaining equal favor, Raphael. Younger, smoother, and more politically adept, Raphael was decorating the Pope's private chambers just down the hall. It wasn't a rivalry born of clashing styles, it was ego warfare in brushstrokes. Where Michelangelo saw the human body as a sculptural battlefield, muscles straining against godliness, Raphael painted serenity, harmony, grace. The Vatican had front-row seats to both visions. Divine power versus divine order. They never worked together, but their works were in constant conversation, locked in aesthetic combat. Renaissance art became a chessboard, and these two were kings, threatening checkmate with every fresco. And while brushstrokes clashed in silence, the laugh track of another fictional kitchen carried a very different kind of battle cry from the Type A queen of the sitcom jungle. The Friends character who was an executive and her Type A personality. Monica Geller didn't run a kingdom. She ran an apartment, a kitchen, and every social dynamic around her like a general in an apron. Played by Courtney Cox, Monica was the textbook Type A personality. Competitive, neurotic, obsessive, controlling, and endearing. She wasn't the star, but she was the engine. What's uncanny is how often Monica's real personality bled into the group dynamic. In the chaos of 6 cohabiting lives, she became the one who laminated chore charts and ranked romantic partners. She wasn't just a chef, she was the emotional sous chef of the entire show. This isn't coincidence by accident. In long-running sitcoms, characters often start to reflect their actors, or the writing warps to suit the performance. Monica's intensity, her obsessive cleanliness, her unyielding competitiveness, it became her comedy and her tragedy. She was the one who would run out of ribbon on Christmas Eve and still host the perfect dinner. the one who turned emotional repression into high-functioning project management. She wasn't just organized, she was armored. And while Monica battled with vacuums and holiday seating charts, one British songwriter sat with a melody he dreamed to write a song that everyone else would cover for decades. The musician who wrote Yesterday, and its enduring popularity. Paul McCartney woke up with a tune in his head. That's not a metaphor, he literally dreamed it. The melody arrived fully formed, so complete he was convinced it had to already exist. He called it Scrambled Eggs while searching for the real lyrics. Eventually, those placeholder lines evolved into Yesterday. A song so haunting, so melancholic in its simplicity, it became the most covered song in music history. Over 2,000 versions and counting. Here's the eerie part. McCartney wasn't heartbroken when he wrote it. He wasn't grieving. But the song aches. It bleeds nostalgia and quiet despair. It's the sound of loss without a reason. Sometimes art doesn't come from pain, it arrives prepackaged, and the artist just becomes the delivery system. Yesterday didn't just make McCartney a ballad icon, it marked a shift in the Beatles' evolution from mop-top pop to introspective innovators. And as their lyrics matured, so did their impact. A dream, a whisper, and a legacy that still plays in elevators, weddings, and lonely kitchens. And as McCartney hummed heartbreak into a microphone, one Southern writer was sketching courtroom injustice into a tale that would echo through American literature with a childhood friend watching from the wings. The author of To Kill a Mockingbird and her friendship with Truman Capote. Harper Lee gave the world Atticus Finch, Scout, and one of the most quietly devastating critiques of American justice ever printed. But behind the literary veil was a real-world connection just as layered, her childhood friendship with Truman Capote. Lee and Capote grew up next door to each other in Monroeville, Alabama. He was flamboyant, precocious, and already rehearsing for literary fame. She was reserved, observant, and fiercely intelligent. Together, they made an odd para Southern Gothic duo wandering through dusty yards and racially divided towns. It's long been rumored that Capote was the model for Dill, the curious, pint-sized outsider in To Kill a Mockingbird. And Lee, in turn, famously helped Capote research in Cold Blood, conducting interviews and earning trust he never could. But while In Cold Blood was hailed as the birth of the non-fiction novel, Capote's descent into notoriety was steep. Meanwhile, Lee never published another novel in her lifetime. Their friendship frayed. Fame, jealousy, differing values, it all calcified into silence. What's haunting is how both captured the American psyche, Capote through crime, Lee through innocence lost. They came from the same backyard, yet walked entirely different literary roads. And as they immortalized the South in ink, another director used sweet syrup to mimic blood, spilling it in a shower that rewrote film forever. The film Psycho and the use of chocolate syrup. Alfred Hitchcock knew that sometimes terror doesn't come from what you see, but from what you think you've seen. And in Psycho, the infamous shower scene is a masterclass in suggestion, stabbing violins. A screaming woman, a shadowy figure, and blood, lots of it. Except it wasn't blood, it was chocolate syrup. Filmed in black and white, color accuracy didn't matter. What mattered was texture, viscosity, and how the liquid moved across the porcelain and flesh. Chocolate syrup Hershey's reportedly was thick, cheap, and visually perfect. It turned a bathroom into a crime scene and a film into an unshakable cultural artifact. But it's more than a fun trivia fact. The use of something so sweet, so ordinary, as a stand-in for violence captures the entire ethos of Psycho. The familiar turned malevolent, a roadside motel, a polite innkeeper, a hot shower. Nothing should go wrong until everything does. That scene splintered Hollywood's innocence. It kicked down the door for modern horror and blurred the line between artist and sadist. And as syrup swirled down the drain, a rock band would design a logo that never bled but burned into the cultural cortex like a brand. The band, the Rolling Stones and their tongue and lips logo. The Rolling Stones didn't just change music, they branded rebellion. And no symbol screams louder than that crimson mouth, tongue outstretched, defiant, and immortal. Created in 1971 by designer John Pash, the logo was meant to capture the essence of Mick Jagger. Loud, provocative, unapologetically sexual. But it went further than mere likeness. The tongue and lips logo became a pop culture Rorschach test. Was it lust? Protest? Ego? All of the above? It was simultaneously an emblem of hedonism and a middle finger to polite society. Unlike other band logos, it wasn't just a name or icon, it was a mouth-a thing that speaks, sings, mocks. Ironically, the logo outlived many of the cultural critiques it sparked. It adorned t-shirts, lighters, dorm walls, a symbol of rebellion mass-produced for suburban malls. And yet, it never lost its edge. Even sanitized, it carried an echo of danger. In the end, a band that made its fortune on blues riffs and bad behavior accidentally gave capitalism one of its most enduring tattoos. And just as empires rise and fall through logos and lips, another empire once ensured its future not through bloodlines, but through adoption, ambition, and marble halls. The Roman emperor who adopted a successor. In ancient Rome, blood was optional, but legacy was mandatory. And Emperor Trajan understood that better than most. As one of the so-called 5 good emperors, he had no biological heir. So he did something surprisingly logical and deeply political. He adopted a man named Hadrian. This wasn't some sentimental family affair, it was a strategic handoff, as clean and cold as a Senate decree. Adoption in Rome wasn't about orphaned children, it was about power succession. Trajan saw in Hadrian a capable administrator, a fellow Spaniard, and a leader who could keep the borders intact without unraveling everything he'd built. What makes this especially haunting is how well it worked. Hadrian went on to rule with caution and brilliance, fortifying the empire rather than expanding it, building walls instead of waging wars. He was both legacy and rupture, a continuation of Trajan's ambition, filtered through realism. By choosing an heir based on merit rather than birthright, Trajan may have temporarily cheated the imperial curse of madness and murder. And while he handed off power with calculated clarity, another Midwestern painter was turning forks, scowls, and silence into symbolson, a canvas that would become iconic twice over. The painter of American Gothic and his rural background. Yes, we've met Grant Wood already. But the thing about American Gothic is it keeps circling back, much like the pitchfork the man clutches in that painting, straight as judgment and sharp as silence. It's a rural icon, a domestic deadpan, a portrait so stiff it practically hums with repressed emotion. What's often forgotten is just how personal this work was for Wood. He grew up in Iowa. He understood the soil beneath the fingernails, the porch-like conversations, the quiet struggle to maintain dignity under economic pressure. That painting isn't a joke, it's a mirror held up to his own past. The people in the portrait weren't strangers. They were his sister and his dentist. But through composition and title, they became something bigger, symbols of American fortitude or American stubbornness, depending on how long you stare. The house behind them? A real place. That pitchfork? Real too. Wood wasn't mocking the Midwest. He was mythologizing it, 1 square inch at a time. And just as Grant Wood fixed Americana in paint, another composer used brass, strings, and an oncoming storm to conjure war so terrifying it became cinematic shorthand for apocalypse. The composer of The Ride of the Valkyries and its use in popular culture. Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries wasn't written for helicopters, but you'd be forgiven for thinking otherwise. Thanks to Apocalypse Now, the piece has become synonymous with impending destruction, military might, and operatic madness. Originally, it was part of Die Walküre, the second opera in Wagner's epic Ring cycle. The Valkyries, mythological warrior women, were tasked with collecting the souls of the dead and carrying them to Valhalla. The music that accompanies them? Bombastic, charging, elemental. But here's where it gets truly eerie. That same mythic grandeur made it perfect for a 20th century war film. In Apocalypse Now, American helicopters blast the Valkyrie theme while launching a brutal assault on a Vietnamese village. It's over the top, it's absurd, and it's horrifyingly effective. Wagner's music, steeped in nationalism and myth, became the soundtrack for real-life Imperial overreach. What was once intended as a ride for spirits became a dirge for the living. The author of Moby Dick and his whaling experience. Herman Melville didn't imagine the sea he survived it. Before Moby Dick became the literary white whale of American fiction, Melville was just another sailor, battered and broken by the indifferent fists of the ocean. He signed onto a whaling ship called the Acushnet in 1841 at age 21. The voyage lasted over a year, and it was a masterclass in salt, sweat, and despair. That real-life experience seeped into every crevice of Moby Dick. It's why the book reads like a theological fever dream penned by someone who's both awed and disgusted by the sea. The minutiae of whaling. The boredom and brutality. The cosmic dread of staring into the eyes of a creature that doesn't care if you exist. Melville knew those ropes, those decks, that endless horizon. He knew the madness that creeps in when you're trapped in wood with nothing but waves and men who stopped blinking weeks ago. Captain Ahab wasn't an invention, he was an echo. And yet, the book flopped. Melville died forgotten, buried in literary obscurity. Only decades later did readers realize he had seen something most of us miss, that sometimes the real monster is the meaning we chase. And speaking of unlikely heroes on galactic journeys, one towering Wookiee once shared a ship with a man who later dabbled in politics. The Star Wars actor who became a politician. Peter Mayhew didn't speak a word as Chewbacca, but he roared his way into pop culture with a growl, a heart, and a bandolier. Standing at 7'3", Mayhew was cast as the loyal Wookiee sidekick in Star Wars, a role that made him instantly recognizable even if his face was hidden behind fur and growls. But what few remember is how Mayhew used his platform off-screen. While he never held political office, he became deeply involved in charitable and political causes, especially those relating to children's hospitals and disability awareness. He visited veterans, raised money for kids in wheelchairs, and appeared at countless events, not as a celebrity, but as a symbol of strength that didn't need to speak to be heard. There's something poetically absurd about a man who played an alien sidekick in space battles, becoming a sort of earthbound ambassador of goodwill. The irony isn't lost. The character who couldn't speak English became a spokesperson for empathy. Mayhew proved that heroism doesn't require dialogue, just consistency and compassion. And while he used kindness to connect galaxies, another ancient contest of speed and strength would bind a civilization together under the flaming torch of immortality. The first recorded Olympic Games and the ancient Greeks. 776 BC. That's the earliest known date of the ancient Olympic Games. And already the Greeks were obsessed with one thing: being the best while nearly naked. These weren't just sporting events, they were sacred rites. Tributes to Zeus performed under the blistering sun in Olympia. The idea was simple: unify the Greek city, states often at war with the one thing they all respected more than philosophy and wine: glory. For a few days, rivalries were paused, wars were halted, and men gathered to throw, run, wrestle, and race their way into legend. But there was a strange, almost eerie commitment to the purity of the games. No women were allowed to compete, sometimes not even to watch. Cheating was punished by inscribing the offender's name on statues placed in shameful proximity to the stadium. And victories weren't rewarded with gold or cash, but with olive wreaths and the eternal whisper of history. What's chilling is how effective it was. The games endured for centuries, surviving political chaos, plagues, and changing gods. Even today, echoes of that dusty stadium survive every time someone stands on a podium and weeps. And long before we had websites to stream it, one man made the whole web itself possible with zero fanfare. The invention of the World Wide Web and the rise of the Internet. In 1989, while the rest of the world was preoccupied with the Cold War's dying breath and the birth of late-stage capitalism, Tim Berners-Lee quietly reprogrammed civilization from a desk at CERN. His invention? The World Wide Web. Not the internet itself that was already humming through cables and Pentagon phone lines, but the interface, the language of hyperlinks, browsers, and URLs. The glue that made the web stick. The haunting part is how unceremonious it all was. No press release, no IPO, just a proposal, a prototype, and a vision of decentralized information sharing. What Berners-Lee unleashed wasn't just a new technology, it was a new species of culture, a digital Wild West, a library where anyone could write the books, a mirror if you stared too long. Within a few years, the web mutated into everything: commerce, surveillance, pornography, revolution, a Frankenstein of pure intent wrapped in corporate arms. And through it all, Berners-Lee remained something of a digital monk, advocating for open access and ethical design while the world cashed in. He gave us the keys. What we built was a madhouse. And before websites curated your dreams, one artist melted clocks across a barren landscape, sketching time as if it could drip off a bone. The artist who painted the persistence of memory and his Spanish roots. Salvador Dali didn't just paint dream, she painted the nightmares that sneak in after the dreams have gotten bored. The persistence of memory, 1931, is a surrealist monument. A soft, aching hallucination of melting clocks, desolate cliffs, and time turning into wax. The painting is small, barely larger than a sheet of paper, but its cultural footprint is gargantuan. Dalí was born in Catalonia, a region of Spain that itself seems constantly stretched between identity and illusion. That paradox seeped into everything he created. Mustache like a tuning fork for God. Personality larger than the canvas. But at the heart of the absurdity was a very grounded grief. The melted clocks, not just whimsy. Dalí was obsessed with mortality, decay, and the futility of measuring something as brutal as time. His Spanish heritage runs through the image, from the barren cliffs resembling Cadaqués to the dry heat implied in the landscape's stillness. Dalí saw Spain not as a country but as a psychic state unlit, brutal, religious, and hysterical. His surrealism wasn't escapism, it was diagnosis. And as Dalí dripped time like a confession, a certain cartoon villain ran from Mayor not as a joke, but as a disturbingly accurate mirror to democracy's absurd vulnerabilities. The Simpsons episode where Sideshow Bob runs for mayor. Sideshow Bob Roberts isn't just an episode of The Simpsons, it's a political prophecy dressed in slapstick. When Bob, the erudite, psychotic former sidekick, decides to run for mayor of Springfield, no one takes it seriously. He's a convicted felon, a cartoonish villain with a voice like Shakespearean velvet. And yet, he wins. How? Voter fraud, manipulated machines, a media circus. It was meant as satire, of course an exaggerated warning about the ease with which charm and corruption can override logic. But the years have turned that joke into something colder. The segment skewers everything: how easily voters are swayed, how power structures reward chaos, how the illusion of choice is often just that, an illusion. Bob's campaign is polished, manipulative, and dripping in pseudo-intellectual arrogance. He's not running to serve, he's running because he can. And the creepiest part? For a moment, it works. The town cheers. Democracy is just another tool in the villain's kit. When comedy predicts collapse, it stops being funny. And as Bob's smirk fades into reruns, another king of rock once smirked tune stage, hips swinging, causing such moral panic you'd think he'd declared war with a dance. The musician who sang Hound Dog and his iconic dance moves. Elvis Presley didn't just sing, he erupted. When he performed Hound Dog on national television in 1956, it wasn't the lyrics that caused a scandal, it was his hips. They swayed, they rolled. They suggested things that mid-century America wasn't ready to admit it even wanted to see. To modern eyes, it seems tame. But at the time, it was a national emergency of morals. Entire news segments were devoted to condemning Elvis's indecency. Camera angles were adjusted to film him only from the waist up. Religious leaders denounced him. Columnists clutched their pearls through typewriters. And what was he doing? Dancing. To a song originally written for and made famous by Big Mama Thornton, a black woman whose raw version carried the weight of blues and betrayal. Elvis repackaged it, shined it up, and gave it to white America with a swivel. He didn't invent rock and roll. He translated it for an audience that would have ignored its origins otherwise. That dance didn't just shake his legs. It cracked open a culture. And while he twitched toward infamy, another woman quietly picked up a man's name and rewrote what it meant to tell a woman's story with fire, madness, and a locked attic. The author of Jane Eyre and Her Pen Name, Charlotte Bronte, a woman who wrote like thunder wrapped in lace, had to lie just to be heard. When Jane Eyre was published in 1847, it bore the name Currer Bell, a masculine pseudonym, deliberately vague, deliberately safe. Because in 19th century England, if you wanted to write something passionate, defiant, and psychologically radical, you'd better do it while wearing a literary disguise. Bronte didn't just tell the story of an orphan governess. She told the story of self-respect, forged in fire. Jane Eyre doesn't marry for money or status. She doesn't collapse when betrayed. She walks into love with her spine intact. And her creator, meanwhile, was slipping her manuscripts past male editors under a false name. The irony? The book was an immediate success. Critics hailed it until they realized Currer Bell was a woman. Then the admiration turned suspicious. How could a woman write something so bold? So intellectually fierce? Bronte's anonymity wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. And long before she resurrected her identity, another empire was attempting the opposite, erasing identity from a city so ancient. Its name was a hymn and a battlefield. The Roman emperor who made Jerusalem a Roman colony. Hadrian wasn't content to rule Rome, he wanted to sculpt the world in marble, to turn geography into ideology. After crushing the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea around 135 AD, Hadrian didn't just defeat the rebels. He tried to erase their memory. He renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina and banned Jews from even entering the city. The ancient city of David became a Roman colony by imperial fiat. This wasn't mere urban planning. It was identity warfare, an attempt to overwrite culture with columns, gods with temples, and grief with statues. Hadrian's motivations were complex, part vengeance, part political expedience, part philosophical ambition. He believed in order, in symmetry, in empire, not just as power, but as aesthetic. To him, Jerusalem wasn't sacred, it was a blank canvas. But cities, remember, beneath every stone lies another, and Jerusalem, that eternal fault line of faith and fury, refused to stay rewritten. Hadrian thought he could rename a soul, but centuries later, the city would burn and rise again, over and over. And while empires fell and languages changed, one band stitched their identities into a single image-turning zodiac signs into rock and roll heraldry. The band Queen and their iconic logo. Before Queen was a band, it was a symbol. And that symbol, a Baroque crest packed with mythological creatures, wasn't designed by a marketing firm. It was hand-drawn by Freddie Mercury himself. A man who understood that showmanship begins before the first note. The logo is a visual mashup of zodiac signs, 2 lions, for Roger Taylor and John Deacon, a crab, for Brian May, and 2 fairies, for Mercury, the Virgo. crowned by a giant phoenix, it's less of a band insignia and more of a royal sigil for an empire of glitter and guitar solos. This wasn't irony, this was intent. Queen wasn't just about music, they were about myth-making. Mercury didn't just want to sing, he wanted to transcend. The logo told you what to expect: grandeur, drama, unapologetic pomp. And decades later, it still holds power. It appears on stage banners, t-shirts, box sets. It's heraldry for those who worship at the altar of glam. The joke is that Queen named themselves with a wink. The truth is they ruled like monarch's own anthem at a time. And just as their crest crowned a cultural dynasty, a choking fog once forced London to finally confront what it had been exhaling into its own lungs. The Great Smog of London and air pollution legislation. It started like any other cold December haze drifting over London in 1952, but this wasn't mist. It was death in slow motion. A toxic cocktail of coal smoke, industrial emissions, and stagnant air that settled over the city for 5 days, turning the skyline into a sepia horror show. By the time it cleared, an estimated 4,000 people were dead. Thousands more would die in the weeks that followed. Horses collapsed in the streets. Visibility dropped to mere feet. Crime surged. Trains were canceled. Plays were halted mid-performance. And yet, the government hesitated to act. Why? Because this wasn't an earthquake or a bombing. It was self-inflicted. The Great Smog wasn't a natural disaster, it was the price of progress, the soot of empire, inhaled. But the catastrophe was too massive to ignore. It forced the passage of the Clean Air Act in 1956, one of the earliest environmental laws of its kind. London had suffocated on its own fume sound, finally, belatedly, decided to breathe differently. The irony? It took a cloud of death to clear the air.